Picture the land at dusk, the hour when the stones of Jerusalem turn the color of old blood and the shadows lengthen across the terraced fields below. A traveler coming up from Jericho on the switchback road would lift his eyes at a certain bend and see it, rising out of the limestone spine of the country like a vision that refused to make sense. A vast white platform, the size of a small city, and on that platform, a temple plated in so much gold that the light coming off it in the late afternoon made men shield their eyes. The rabbis would say, in the generations after it was burned, that whoever had not seen Herod's temple had never seen a beautiful building in his life. They meant it. They had reason to. It was the most ambitious single piece of architecture in the eastern Mediterranean, and it had been raised, stone by fitted stone, by a man who was hated by the very people he was trying to impress. The year was somewhere near the close of the 1st century before Christ. The sun setting over an occupied country, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was pregnant with a change so enormous that the calendars of every empire yet to rise would be forced to count forward and backward from a night that had not yet come. This is the stage. Before any of the figures walk onto it, before the old priest and the barren wife, before the angel in the sanctuary and the child leaping in the womb of his mother's kinswoman, the stage itself has to be understood, because the stage is the whole meaning of what happens on it. A stage sets the rules. A stage tells you what is possible and what is not. And the stage in Judea, in the days of Herod the king, had been arranged by forces so immense and so cruel that the quiet, domestic, almost embarrassingly small miracle that was about to unfold in the hill country would look by contrast like a candle lit in a hurricane. To understand the hurricane, you have to go backward. The Jewish people had spent most of their recorded history being told, by their own prophets, that they were special, chosen, set apart, carried out of Egypt on an eagle's wings, given a land flowing with milk and honey, given a king after God's own heart, given a temple so holy that the glory of the Lord was said to have settled on it like a cloud when Solomon dedicated it nearly 1,000 years before Christ. And then, slowly, over generations, they had been told something else by the same prophets. They had been told that the covenant could be broken, that milk could go sour, that kings could be fools, that the glory could leave a temple as quietly as it had come. And then, in the year 586 before Christ, the Babylonians had come down out of the north under Nebuchadnezzar, and the warnings had stopped being metaphor. The walls of Jerusalem were breached. The temple of Solomon was stripped of its treasures, its bronze pillars cut up for scrap, its holy of holies emptied, and the whole sacred structure burned to the foundations. The best of the people were dragged east in chains, seated along the rivers of Babylon, and they sat down and wept when they remembered Zion, because Zion was no more. They came back. That part of the story is often forgotten, because the coming back was not glamorous. 70 years after the exile, when Cyrus of Persia issued his decree in the year 538 before Christ permitting the Jews to return to their land, only a fraction of them came. The rest had built houses in Babylon, married, had children, grown used to the rivers of a foreign country. The returning remnant, under a man named Zerubbabel, built a second temple on the ruins of the first. It was a smaller thing. The old men who remembered Solomon's house wept at the dedication because this new structure looked like a shed compared to what had been. But it was a temple. It had an altar. The daily sacrifices resumed. The courses of the priests were restored. The prophet Haggai told the people, in the name of the Lord, that the glory of this latter house would be greater than the former, and for a little while the Jews took him at his word. That was around 516 before Christ, 5 centuries before the birth of the child this story is about. And then, after the prophet Malachi closed his scroll, something strange happened. Or rather, something stopped happening. The prophets stopped speaking. For 400 years, from roughly the time of Malachi until the events this story will eventually describe, the voice that had thundered through the prophets of Israel since the days of Moses went quiet. No burning bush, no still small voice in the cave, no man in a hair shirt striding out of the wilderness with a word from the Lord on his tongue. The rabbis called this gap the silence, and they meant by it something precise. The Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit in its prophetic form, had been withdrawn. God was still there. The sacrifices continued. The festivals were kept. The priests burned the incense and offered the lambs at the appointed hours. But the living voice of prophecy, the voice that had said, "Thus saith the Lord," for 1,000 years, had fallen silent. And a whole civilization was left straining to hear something it could no longer quite make out. What filled those 4 centuries was history, and history has a way of filling silences with noise. After Malachi, the Persian Empire that had allowed the return gave way to a new power sweeping east out of Macedonia, a young man with pale eyes and an impossible ambition named Alexander. He swept through Palestine in the year 332 before Christ on his way to Egypt, and legend has it he bowed to the high priest in Jerusalem because he had dreamed of the man in his youth. Alexander died young in Babylon at 32, and his generals divided his empire among themselves like wolves at a carcass. Judea fell first to the Ptolemies in Egypt, and then, after a century or so, to the Seleucids in Syria. And it was under the Seleucids that the land suffered one of the great desecrations of its history. A king named Antiochus IV, who styled himself Epiphanes, God made manifest, tried to erase the Jewish faith entirely. In the year 167 before Christ, he set up an altar to Zeus in the Holy of Holies and sacrificed a pig on it. He banned circumcision. He banned the Sabbath. He ordered the scrolls of the law to be burned wherever they were found, and the mothers who circumcised their sons in defiance were crucified with the infants hung around their necks. This was the abomination that made desolate, the phrase the book of Daniel had cryptically used, and the Jews who had memorized Daniel in their childhoods understood. When they saw the smoke rising off a pig on God's altar, exactly what prophecy they were living through. Out of that horror came a family. A country priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons, the most famous of whom was Judas the Hammer. Judas Maccabeus rose up in revolt against the Seleucid tyranny. They were outnumbered, outarmed, and theologically committed to fighting on the Sabbath, even though their enemies knew to attack them on that day. They won anyway. They drove the Greeks out of Jerusalem. They cleansed the temple. They relit the menorah with a single cruse of consecrated oil that, the story says, burned for 8 days when it should have lasted 1, which is why Jewish families still light candles in December in remembrance of it. And the family of Mattathias, called the Hasmoneans after an ancestor, became the new rulers of an independent Jewish state for the first time in 4 centuries. For about 80 years, from roughly 140 to 63 before Christ, the Jews governed themselves again. They minted their own coins. They fought their own wars. They expanded their borders. And, because power corrupts even the devout and the descendants of martyrs, they tore themselves to pieces. The Hasmonean dynasty was a cautionary tale before it was finished. Brother fought brother. Uncle plotted against nephew. The high priesthood and the kingship were combined into a single office in violation of the old separations, and the men who held that office grew less like the pious country priest who had started the revolt, and more like the Hellenistic kings his sons had fought to the death. And then, in the year 63 before Christ, with 2 Hasmonean brothers named Hyrcanus and Aristobulus locked in a civil war over the throne, both of them made the catastrophic error of appealing to Rome. The Roman general Pompey the Great was in Syria at the time, mopping up the remnants of the old Eastern world. He listened to the case of one brother, then the other, and then he did what Rome always did when invited into a dispute. He took the city. Pompey marched on Jerusalem, laid siege to the Temple Mount for 3 months. And when the walls finally breached, he walked personally into the Holy of Holies to see what was inside. The story is that he was astonished to find it empty. He had expected idols, gold, the kind of thing that filled the inner sanctuaries of every other temple in the world he had conquered. Instead, there was a small, dark, silent room with nothing in it. He left it alone. He did not loot it, but he had entered it. A pagan had stood in the place where only the high priest of Israel could stand, and only once a year. And the shock of that violation rang through the Jewish consciousness for generations. The independence was over. Judea was now, and would remain for the rest of this story and long after it, a Roman province in one form or another. The boot on the neck was not Greek anymore. It was Italian, and it fitted. Rome ruled its new possession through intermediaries. For a time there were client princes and puppet high priests, shuffled in and out as the politics of the wider Mediterranean demanded. But in the year 37 before Christ, a new man rose to the kingship of Judea with Roman backing, and he was the man under whose shadow the whole story you are about to hear would take place. His name was Herod. The histories would call him Herod the Great, and they would mean it in both the admiring and the appalled sense of that word. Great as in enormous. Great as in monumental. Great as in a disaster on a grand scale. Herod was not, by blood, a Jew. He was an Idumean, which is to say, he came from the line of Esau, the old elder brother of Jacob, the people whom the Jews had regarded with wary contempt since the days of the patriarchs. His family had been forcibly converted to Judaism 2 generations before him, during the expansionist phase of the Hasmoneans, and he had been raised as a nominal observer of the law. But nobody in Jerusalem was fooled. In the eyes of the Pharisees and the common people, Herod was a half-Jew at best, a foreigner in priestly clothing, an impostor on a throne that belonged by right to the old royal line of David, or at least to the Hasmonean line that had driven the Greeks out. He knew it. He spent his entire reign trying to prove otherwise, and the proving drove him mad. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the more gifted rulers the ancient world produced. He was a brilliant administrator. He was a competent general. He had a political instinct so finely tuned that he survived 3 successive regime changes in Rome itself, shifting his loyalty from Mark Antony to Octavian at precisely the right moment after the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ, bowing before the new Emperor Augustus, and emerging from the interview not only alive, but with his kingdom expanded. He fed his country through famines at his own expense. He kept the peace on the trade routes. He built cities. He built fortresses. He built the magnificent harbor at Caesarea Maritima, cutting it out of open coast with Roman concrete and turning a stretch of empty beach into one of the great ports of the eastern Mediterranean. He built the desert palace at Masada, on top of an unreachable plateau, a fortress with swimming pools and storerooms and 3 tiers of hanging gardens, because he was always, at some level, planning his own escape. And he built, or rather rebuilt, the temple. This is the piece of his legacy that stands closest to our story. The second temple that Zerubbabel had raised 5 centuries earlier had grown shabby and cramped, and Herod, with his taste for grandeur and his bottomless need to be seen as a pious Jewish king, announced around the year 20 before Christ that he would tear it down and build something worthy of the God of Israel, and not incidentally, worthy of the king who financed it. He did not, strictly speaking, tear the old temple down. He could not. The priests would never have allowed sacrificial worship to be interrupted. What he did instead was engulf it. He doubled, and then doubled again, the size of the Temple Mount by building out enormous retaining walls of dressed limestone, some of the stones weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together without mortar so precisely that a knife blade could not be slipped between them. On top of this artificial platform, the largest religious enclosure in the ancient world, he raised a complex of courts, porticos, gates, and chambers that the prophet Haggai's promise of greater glory finally seemed to some people to have been fulfilled in. The sanctuary itself, the inner building with its holy place and its holy of holies behind the great curtain, was rebuilt by priests specially trained as masons so that no profane hand would touch its sacred stones. The outer walls he plated with gold. The pillars of the colonnades were each carved from a single block of marble so tall that 3 men with their arms outstretched could just barely reach around one. The outer court, the court of the Gentiles, was big enough to hold crowds of 100,000 or more on pilgrimage festivals, and at the great feasts it did. Inside that court, separated by a low barrier called the Soreg, with warning signs in Greek and Latin threatening death to any Gentile who crossed it, lay the inner courts, the court of the women, where female worshippers could go no further, the court of Israel for Jewish men, and the court of the priests, where the great altar of sacrifice stood, open to the sky, with its ramps and its channels for the blood to drain away. Beyond all of this, set back against the western wall of the inner sanctuary, was the temple building proper, and within its innermost chamber was the small, dark room where, once a year and only once, one man in all the world was permitted to enter. This is the temple you need to see in your mind's eye as this story begins. This is the temple where the old priest will cast lots with his colleagues for the honor of entering the holy place and burning the incense on the golden altar. This is the temple where he will see something no man in 400 years had expected to see again. But Herod the Great did not build it for that moment. Herod the Great did not know that moment was coming. He built it for himself because he was a paranoid, brilliant, half-Edomite, Roman-backed, Jewish-professing, murder-haunted king who wanted more than anything else to be remembered, and who had every reason to suspect that without a monument of this scale, he would not be. He had every reason because of what he had done to his own family. Herod had 10 wives. He married for love, for politics, for convenience, for the thrill of possessing what could not be possessed. The wife he loved most deeply, by every account, was a Hasmonean princess named Mariamne, the granddaughter of the old high priests, the last of the royal line he had displaced. She was, it seems, breathtakingly beautiful, and she hated him. She made no secret of it. She reminded him daily that he was a usurper, that he had murdered her grandfather and her brother to secure his throne, which he had, and that her line was the true line of Judea. Herod loved her anyway. He loved her more than any man in his court could afford to love anyone. And when rumors reached him, falsely it seems, that she had been unfaithful, he had her executed. Then he went mad with grief. He called her name through the halls of his palace for months. He ordered his servants to tell him that she was only out, that she would return soon, and he had them flogged when they refused to pretend. He had her 2 sons by him raised as princes of the blood, the rightful heirs of both his kingship and the Hasmonean legacy, and then, when they grew to manhood, he had them strangled in Sebaste on suspicion of plotting against him. Augustus, the emperor who had given Herod everything, was said to have remarked that he would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son, a joke that worked in Greek because the word for pig and the word for son sounded alike, and that worked in any language because Herod, being nominally Jewish, would not kill a pig, but he had proven 3 times over that he would kill a son. This, then, was the man on the throne in Jerusalem when the story you are waiting to hear began. A king who had slaughtered his way to the crown and slaughtered his way to keep it. A builder of unspeakable monuments. A patron of Greek games and Roman festivals and Jewish sacrifices, keeping all 3 audiences nervously appeased. A husband who had killed the woman he loved. A father who had killed the children he had fathered with her. An old man by the end, sick with a disease the ancient writers describe in lurid detail, his body rotting from within, scratching at his ulcers with a dagger, screaming at his attendants, planning even on his deathbed a final atrocity to ensure there would be mourning in Judea on the day of his death, even if none of it was for him. That is the man in whose shadow the old priest and his wife live out their quiet, obedient, childless lives in the hill country. That is the king in whose temple the old priest goes up to serve his 1 week in 6 months. That is the court from whose ledgers, a little later in our story, another small family will have to flee into Egypt because of a different set of infants. Herod is the weather system over the whole of this narrative. You cannot understand the rain without understanding the cloud. Above Herod, above his court, above his temple stood Rome, and above Rome, in the minds of the devout, nothing but the silence of God. Rome had chosen, for the sake of convenience, to let Judea keep its temple and its law and its festivals. Augustus was not Antiochus Epiphanes. The emperor had no desire to provoke the Jews into revolt, because revolt in a small province at the eastern edge of the empire was bad for trade and worse for tax collection. So the Romans allowed the sacrifices to continue. They allowed the Sanhedrin, the council of 70 elders and the high priest, to adjudicate matters of Jewish law. They kept their legions out of the holy city itself, except during the great festivals, when the pilgrim crowds made rebellion most likely, and a show of force was prudent. The procurators, when they eventually came to run the province directly a few years after Herod's death, ruled from Caesarea on the coast, not from Jerusalem. For most Jews, in most villages most of the time, Rome was not a soldier at your door. Rome was a tax assessment. Rome was a coin with a foreign face on it that you had to use to pay the tax. Rome was an absence, but a heavy absence, a weight pressing down on the whole country even when you could not see it. The tax was, in many ways, the most hated thing. The Romans farmed out their tax collection to local men, publicani, who bid for the right to collect in a given district. Whatever they collected above the amount they had bid, they kept. This system guaranteed corruption, because the only way to make a profit was to squeeze harder than Rome required. The tax collectors, the publicans, became a byword in Jewish society for everything that had gone wrong under foreign rule. They were Jews collaborating with the occupier. They were men profiting off the suffering of their own neighbors. They were the ones who knew, to the last denarius, how much bread you had taken out of your own children's mouths to pay Caesar. And Caesar's portrait on the coins looked back at you as if it had a right to be there. Underneath the tax was the deeper wound, the wound that made every other indignity sting worse than it should have. The Jews had been told over and over that they were the people of the Lord, that the Lord would be their king, and that no foreign power would ever finally rule over them. The Psalms sang it. The prophets promised it. The law, at its heart, assumed it. And yet here they were, 6 centuries since the first exile, a century since Pompey had walked into the Holy of Holies, and the only king in Jerusalem was an Idumean murderer propped up by Italian legions. Something did not add up. Either the promises had been false, which no pious Jew could accept, or they were yet to be fulfilled, which meant the fulfillment was coming. This arithmetic of deferred hope was the engine driving Jewish life in the days of Herod. It was a hope so old and so worn smooth by repetition that it had taken on different shapes in different hands, depending on who was holding it. The Pharisees held it one way. They were, by and large, lay teachers, scholars of the law, middle-class men from the towns who had taken upon themselves the yoke of interpretation. They built fences around the commandments. They reasoned about what the law meant and how a pious man ought to live it in the small details of every weekday. How far he could walk on the Sabbath, what he could carry, how he could wash his hands before a meal. They were not, despite their later reputation, merely hypocrites. They were, on the whole, sincere men who believed that Israel's exile among the nations was a punishment for the nation's failure to keep the law, and that the way to bring the Messiah was for enough Jews to keep the law faithfully enough for long enough that God would finally act. Their Messiah, when he came, would be a king. He would sit on David's throne. He would drive the Romans out. He would purify the temple and make Jerusalem again the capital of the world. The Sadducees held the hope differently, if they held it at all. They were the aristocratic party, the priestly families, the men who served in the high offices of the temple and who had made their peace with Rome because their power and wealth depended on that peace. They accepted only the first 5 books of the law as scripture. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in angels or in spirits or in the elaborate apocalyptic scenarios that the Pharisees and the common people loved to spin out. They were, in modern terms, the establishment, and like every establishment, they were more interested in the preservation of things as they were than in the coming of anything new. Their Messiah, if they thought about one, was probably the high priest currently in office. Their kingdom of God was whatever functional arrangement currently kept the sacrifices going and the aristocratic families housed on the hill. The Essenes held the hope in a third way altogether. They had withdrawn. Appalled at what they regarded as the corruption of the temple priesthood, sickened by the compromises with Rome, convinced that the whole system had been abandoned by the Spirit, they had fled out into the wilderness of Judea and built settlements in the desert, the most famous of which was on the shores of the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran. They lived in community, sharing their property, eating in common, bathing in ritual pools for purification before every meal, studying the scriptures day and night, waiting. They were waiting for a very specific sequence of events. They believed there would be 2 messiahs, one priestly and one kingly, who would come together at the end of days. They believed the final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness was imminent. They copied the scriptures onto leather scrolls and hid them in jars in the cliff caves above their settlement, where, as it happened, a shepherd boy would find them about 1900 years later, and the world would learn, rather suddenly, how vivid and how near the Essene hope had been. And the zealots held it in a fourth way. They had given up waiting. They believed that the kingdom of God would come only when the people of God took up arms against Rome and fought, and that the longer they delayed, the worse things would get. They would rise in the decades after the events of this story, in the revolt that would destroy the temple Herod had built. In the days Herod was still alive, they were smaller, more scattered, a rumble of discontent in the Galilean hills rather than an organized movement. But they were there, and the tax riots and the assassination plots and the hit-and-run attacks on Roman patrols were already beginning in a small way. And then, below and beyond all of these organized positions, there were the ordinary people. The farmers in the Galilean villages, the shepherds in the hills above Bethlehem, the fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, who would in time find themselves called to an adventure they could never have predicted, the widows in the cities, the country priests who came up to Jerusalem twice a year to serve their turn in the temple, and then went home to their small plots of olive trees and their few acres of barley. These ordinary people held the hope most simply of all. They held it as a rumor passed from grandfather to grandson. They held it in the old messianic psalms sung in the synagogue on the Sabbath. They held it in certain sentences of Isaiah that promised a child would be born and a son given, and the government would be upon his shoulder. They held it in Micah's strange little verse about Bethlehem Ephrathah, too small to be counted among the clans of Judah, out of whom a ruler would come whose origins were from of old, from ancient days. They held it in Daniel's cryptic arithmetic about 70 weeks of years that, if you worked it out on your fingers, seemed to be drawing to a close just about now. The rumor was in the air. It was in the stones. It was in the old books that the scribes copied out by lamplight in the rooms above the synagogues of every town of Judea and Galilee. Something was about to happen. Something had to happen. 4 centuries of silence from heaven was not a permanent condition. The God who had spoken to Abraham, to Moses, to Samuel, to David, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to Ezekiel, to Daniel, to all the others, could not simply have stopped. The prophets themselves had promised that he would not stop. Malachi, the last of them, had closed his scroll with a strange and specific promise. Before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, Elijah the prophet would be sent back. He would come again. He would turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the children to the fathers. And then, only then, the day itself would come. Pious Jews in the days of Herod still set a cup of wine for Elijah at their Passover tables and opened the door for him, half as tradition and half in the wild hope that this year, this Passover, in this dangerous and occupied country, he might actually walk in. Down in the temple, meanwhile, the daily ordering of the sacrificial worship continued as it had for generations, and the institution that ran it was one of the most carefully organized structures in the whole ancient world. The priesthood of Israel had been set in order long before the Second Temple, long before even Solomon's temple, in the reign of David 1,000 years before Christ. David, near the end of his life, had organized the sons of Aaron, the priestly line, into 24 divisions. The arrangement is recorded in the First Book of Chronicles, in the 24th chapter, with all the meticulousness of a civil service register. 16 divisions came from the line of Eleazar, Aaron's third son, and 8 came from the line of Ithamar, his fourth son. David had called the heads of the priestly households together, and they had cast lots to determine the order of service. Lots were taken very seriously in ancient Israel. They were understood to be a way of letting the Lord decide what human choice could not settle fairly, a way of surrendering the small decisions of life to the hand of providence. The lots were cast. The order was established. And each of the 24 divisions was given a name and a number and a week of service. The first lot fell to Jehoiarib, the second to Judea, the third to Harim, the fourth to Seorim, the fifth to Malchijah, the sixth to Mijamin, the seventh to Hakkos. The eighth fell to a priestly family called Abijah, and so on down the roster to the 24th, which fell to Maaziah. The names are recited in Chronicles without comment, a dry, bureaucratic list that no casual reader lingers over. But the eighth one matters. The eighth one, Abijah, is the family into which, 1,000 years after David drew up the list, the old priest of our story would be born. And it is on his division's week of service that Gabriel will come down from heaven to stand beside the altar of incense. The bureaucratic list was not bureaucratic at all. It was a schedule. It was a calendar that ran through the centuries. And at a particular week of a particular year, a particular division would be in the temple, and a particular old man from that division would be chosen by lot to enter the holy place, and everything that followed in human history would pivot on the choice of his name out of a small bronze urn. Each of the 24 divisions served in the temple for 1 week at a time, twice a year, plus the 3 great pilgrim festivals of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, when all 24 divisions were present together to handle the enormous pilgrim crowds. A division consisted of several priestly families, and within each division the lots were cast again every day to determine which individual priests would perform which specific duties. There were many duties. There was the slaughter of the morning and evening lambs. There was the trimming of the great 7-branched menorah and the replenishing of its oil. There was the renewing of the 12 loaves of showbread on the golden table in the holy place. There was the removal of the ashes from the great altar of burnt offering in the outer court. There was the carrying of the wood, the pouring of the wine for the drink offerings, the singing of the psalms by the Levitical choirs, the sounding of the silver trumpets at the appointed hours. And at the center of all of this, twice a day, there was the offering of incense on the small golden altar inside the holy place itself, the chamber just outside the veil that separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. The priest chosen by lot for the incense offering in any given week was considered to have received the highest honor a country priest could receive in his entire lifetime. Most priests went their whole lives without ever being chosen. Some priests were chosen once, and the memory of that one morning or evening was the center around which the rest of their 60 or 70 years on earth orbited. A man might never approach nearer in the flesh to the dwelling place of the Most High than he did in those few minutes. Alone in the gold-plated room, with the incense smoking up into the cedar rafters, and the great curtain looming on its rods, and the congregation praying outside in the court. There were, by the time of Herod the Great, something like 20,000 priests in Israel. They were scattered all over the country, living in the towns assigned to their divisions, farming small plots, teaching in local synagogues, raising families. Only a small minority lived in Jerusalem itself. The rest came up to the city twice a year, when their division's week rolled around, and then went home. The pay was modest. The priests received a portion of certain sacrifices, certain tithes, certain first fruits, enough to supplement a modest living, but not to make anyone rich. The high priesthood at the top of the pyramid was wealthy and political, and often corrupt, appointed and removed by whoever happened to be holding power, whether Herod or the Roman governor or some earlier client king. But the country priests below, the ordinary descendants of Aaron in their 24 divisions, were a different kind of men altogether. They were neither rich nor powerful. They were the theological middle class of ancient Israel. They knew the law. They kept the law. They prayed the Psalms in the mornings and the evenings. They taught their children to read Hebrew from the scrolls in their village synagogues. They waited, as every pious Jew waited, for the consolation of Israel. And when their week came around, twice a year, they packed up their robes and their phylacteries and made the journey up to Jerusalem on the hill roads, and for 7 days they served at the altar of the Most High. One of those 20,000 country priests belonged to the 8th division, the division of Abijah. He lived somewhere in the hill country of Judea, in one of the small limestone villages set into the terraced slopes south of Jerusalem. He was getting on in years. His hair had gone white, or mostly white, and his hands were no longer as steady as they had been, and he had a wife, and she was getting on in years too, and they had no children, which was a kind of quiet, permanent grief in a culture where a man's name was carried by his sons and a woman's place in the community was measured in the cradle she had filled. He did not know that his name was about to be drawn out of the urn. He did not know that an angel was waiting for him. He thought he was simply going up to do his week's duty, as he had done for perhaps 40 years already, in a country under occupation, in a temple built by a murderer, under a sky that had been silent for 400 years. His name was Zechariah, which is a name that had been given to Jewish sons for 1,000 years before him, and would be given to Jewish sons for 2,000 years after, because it meant, in the Hebrew of the old prophets, that Yahweh remembers, Yah has remembered, the Lord has not forgotten. It was the sort of name a pious couple gave a child when they wanted, in the very act of calling him in for supper, to remind themselves and everyone within earshot that the God of their fathers had not turned his face away, even when it seemed he had. There had been many Zechariahs in the history of Israel. There had been Zechariah the prophet, who had written one of the little scrolls at the end of the Jewish canon, a short and strange book full of horses and horns, and a lampstand flanked by 2 olive trees. There had been Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest murdered between the altar and the sanctuary in the dark years before the first exile, whose blood the old chronicles said cried out from the stones of the temple pavement. There had been Zechariahs in every generation, good and bad, remembered and forgotten, buried in ossuaries all over the hill country, with their bones gathered in a year after burial and set into limestone boxes scratched with that same name in that same careful Aramaic lettering. This Zechariah, the one we are concerned with, was none of those men. He was only a country priest in the hill country of Judea, old enough now that his beard had gone the color of candle wax, and his hands trembled a little when he lifted a cup of wine. And yet the name would turn out, as names sometimes do, to have been waiting in the back of his throat his whole life to mean what it actually meant. He lived in a village somewhere in the Judean highlands, in one of those small settlements of unplastered limestone houses clinging to a terraced slope above a dry wadi, where the olive trees grew in rings around the walls, and the grapevines were trained on stone walls that caught the winter rain and held it in the earth through the first half of the dry summer. The village had a single synagogue, a simple rectangular room with a cabinet at the end that held the scrolls, a few rows of stone benches along the walls, and a platform in the middle where, on the Sabbath, one of the elders or a visiting teacher would stand to read. It had a well fed by a spring, and the women of the village gathered there in the cool hours of the morning and the evening with their clay jars balanced on their hips, and the children ran along the paths between the terraces, with nothing much to do until they were old enough to be given something to do. It had a handful of elders who heard the small disputes of the community, a donkey or two tethered in every other courtyard, chickens scratching in the dust, a few dogs that barked at strangers on the path from Jerusalem. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and where the prayers said at evening in any one house could almost be heard in the next house over, because the walls were thin and the village was close, and life was lived much more in the open air than a later, more private kind of person would find comfortable. Jerusalem was a journey of some hours on foot over the hills to the north, a walk Zechariah had made twice a year for most of his adult life, leaving the village with a small pack of food and a change of linen, his priestly garments carefully folded at the bottom of it, and coming back a week later, walking a little more slowly than he had gone, because a week of early mornings at the altar was hard on any man and harder on an older one. His wife was called Elizabeth. That is the Greek rendering of her real name, which in the Hebrew of her parents and the Aramaic of her daily speech was Elisheba, and it was the same name that had been given to the very first priest's wife in the history of Israel, the woman who had married Aaron, the brother of Moses, in the wilderness beneath Mount Sinai, and become the ancestress of the whole priestly line. Elisheba meant, in the old translation, that God is my oath, or perhaps that my God has sworn, or perhaps that the one by whom I swear is God himself. It was a name that carried the whole weight of the covenant in 4 syllables, and her mother and father had chosen it for her the way Jewish parents had been choosing names for their daughters since the patriarchs, as a small private prophecy whispered over a cradle, waiting for a life to grow into it. She was, like her husband, a member of the priestly line. This mattered. The priesthood in Israel was hereditary, passed from father to son through the sons of Aaron, but the daughters of priests were also regarded as being of the priestly blood, and it was considered a particular blessing for a priest to marry a daughter of the priestly line rather than a woman from one of the other tribes. Such marriages kept the sacred blood concentrated. They produced children who were priests on both sides of the family, doubly descended from the original brother of Moses, doubly anchored in the old covenant ceremonies of the Sinai. Elizabeth's father had been a priest. Her grandfather had been a priest. Her great-grandfather had been a priest. If you traced her line back on a roll of animal skin, as the keepers of the genealogies in Jerusalem liked to do, you would find that both her mother's line and her father's line disappeared. At a certain high and ancient point, into the same small campsite, at the foot of the same smoking mountain, where a man in a gold breastplate and a woman in a plain desert robe had once stood up to be married in the presence of the whole assembled people of Israel. She was, in other words, a woman with lineage. She had pedigree in the old sense of the word, the sense that mattered in the ancient world, which was not about money or land, but about who your great-grandfathers had been and what promises had been made to them. She walked out of her house in the morning, carrying the weight of 13 centuries of priestly marriages behind her, and if her neighbors looked at her sometimes with a kind of wary respect, it was because even in a small hill village everyone understood who she was. She was Elizabeth, daughter of a priest, wife of a priest, a daughter of Aaron, and she was childless. Everyone in the village knew that too. You could not hide such a thing. In a hill village of perhaps a few dozen families, in a culture where children were the visible sign of God's favor and the cornerstone of a household's identity, the absence of a child in a particular house was not a private matter. It was a public fact. It was the first thing an aunt mentioned when she came in from another village for the festival. It was the first thing a neighbor's child asked about when she was old enough to ask. It was the thing that sat, unspoken and unmissable, In every Sabbath meal, Zechariah and Elizabeth shared with a family that had children of their own, when the table was full of small faces and their table at home would be set for two. The Scriptures made the weight of it clear, because the Scriptures were nothing if not honest about the weight of it. To be blessed with children was the language in which the blessing itself was almost always expressed. The Psalm said that sons were a heritage from the Lord, that the fruit of the womb was a reward, that the man whose quiver was full of them was happy. The blessing of Rebekah at her wedding had been that she would become the mother of thousands of 10,000s. The blessing of Ruth at her wedding to Boaz had been that she would build up the house of Israel. Every wedding in every village ended with the same formulaic prayers and the same hopeful songs, and every birth was celebrated with singing in the streets and sweet cakes passed through the houses, because children were how a people survived, and how a name survived, and how an inheritance was preserved, and how the covenant between the Lord and his people was extended into another generation. A house without children, then, was not only a house with a certain sadness in it, it was a house that had begun slowly to disappear. A man without sons could not pass on his portion of land, his share in his tribe's inheritance, his name in the village's genealogies. A woman without children had failed in the hardest and most elemental way the ancient world could measure failure, at the one task her body had been given to do. This was not fair. It was not even theologically coherent, if you pressed the people who said it. But it was what everybody in that culture believed, or half believed, or believed at least enough of the time that it made childless women bow their heads in the market and childless men avoid the sharp questions of their uncles at the pilgrim feasts. And Elizabeth had borne the weight of it, year after year, for the whole of her adult life. She was not the first. The women of Israel had, in fact, a certain quiet sisterhood of barrenness that ran through the whole of their scripture like an underground stream, and Elizabeth would have known every story in it by heart. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, had been barren for most of her life, had laughed out loud at the absurdity of being told in her 90s that she would bear a son, and had borne Isaac in the teeth of that laughter. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, had been barren for 20 years before she conceived the twins Jacob and Esau. Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife, had watched her sister Leah bear son after son while her own womb stayed closed, and she had cried out to her husband in a grief so sharp that it was still remembered in every household of Israel centuries later, "Give me children, or I die." The wife of Manoah, whose name the Scripture does not even trouble to record, had been barren until an angel came to her in a field and told her she would bear a son, a Nazarite, who would grow up to be Samson the strong man, a man with a riddle on his lips and a death sentence in his hair. Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel, had wept so bitterly in the sanctuary at Shiloh that the old priest Eli had accused her of being drunk and had promised the Lord that if he gave her a son, she would give the son back to him. And she had, and the boy had grown up to anoint the kings of Israel. These stories were not abstract to Elizabeth. These were the stories she had heard at her mother's knee and sung in the synagogue on the feast days, and repeated to herself, no doubt, in the long hours of the night when she lay awake counting up the months again. Every one of those women had been barren. Every one of them had eventually been visited. Every one of them had borne a son whose life had turned somehow on a hinge that his mother's tears had oiled. Every one of them had been, in the language of the old preachers, a type, a pattern, a small repeating music that the Lord seemed to like, returning to it across the centuries like a composer to a favorite theme. The pattern was this, that out of the wombs most closed to natural hope, the Lord chose to bring the children most important to his purposes. The barren women of Israel had been the mothers of the patriarchs, the deliverers, the prophets. Their empty years had not been, in the end, empty. Their emptiness had been a waiting. Elizabeth knew the stories, and knowing them, she had for years almost certainly allowed herself to hope that she too might be one of them. In the first years of her marriage, in her 20s, when she and Zechariah were newly wed and the whole life of a household stretched out ahead of them, she must have prayed the Lord's Prayer of every barren woman of Israel. Remember me, look upon me, open my womb. Do not let me be a reproach among my people. And in her 30s, when the early hope began to stretch thin, she would have prayed it still, perhaps more fiercely, perhaps with longer silences between the words. And in her 40s, when her friends began to be grandmothers, and the children she had watched as infants in other people's houses were now standing under wedding canopies of their own, she would have prayed it with a kind of chastened quietness, less demanding, more submitted. The prayer of a woman who had accepted that the Lord does not always say yes, and who had begun to prepare her heart to bear a no for the rest of her life. And somewhere in her 50s or her 60s, long before the point at which our story finds her, she would have stopped praying for a child at all, not stopped believing in the Lord, not stopped keeping the law, not stopped loving her husband, or lighting the Sabbath lamps, or teaching the daughters of her neighbors what she knew. Only stopped asking for this one particular thing, because to go on asking for it had become a cruelty she could no longer inflict on her own heart, and because the window in which that particular answer was even biologically possible had long since closed and been shuttered and grown over with ivy. Both of them, the old priest and his wife, were, the record says, righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. That is a weighty phrase in the language of the Jews. To be called righteous in that particular vocabulary did not mean that a person had never sinned, for no pious Jew of Zechariah and Elizabeth's day would have claimed such a thing of any man or woman except perhaps of Moses. And even Moses had struck the rock when he should have spoken to it and been kept out of the promised land for his trouble. Righteousness in the Jewish sense meant something more practical and more achievable than sinlessness. It meant a life ordered by the law. It meant keeping the Sabbath. It meant paying the tithes. It meant making the sacrifices when the sacrifices were required, and observing the festivals at the times the festivals were appointed, and reciting the Shema at the rising and the lying down. It meant, when you fell short, bringing the proper sin offering to the altar, and setting things right according to the law's provisions. A righteous person in Zechariah's generation was a person whose account with the covenant was current. They paid their debts. They made their restitutions. They stood upright in the presence of God and of their neighbors because they had not given either God or neighbor any standing reason to reproach them. Blameless did not mean faultless. Blameless meant that if you called the community together to hear a charge against them, no charge would stick because their lives had been, in all the visible and public ways that a life could be, faithful. This is a description of a particular kind of person, and we would do well to see them clearly, because the whole weight of what is coming will rest on them. Zechariah was not a prophet. He was not a charismatic. He was not a reformer, or an agitator, or a visionary. He was not one of those Essenes out in the wilderness sleeping in caves and copying scrolls by candlelight. He was not one of the Pharisees teaching in the portico in Jerusalem. He was not one of the Sadducees running the temple administration. He was not even, as far as we can tell, a particularly distinguished priest within his own division of Abijah. He was an ordinary, diligent, faithful country priest, one of many thousands, who had done his duty at the altar twice a year for decades and gone home afterwards to his wife and his olive trees and his synagogue. He was the kind of man who keeps the weekly rhythm of prayer so reliably that his neighbors set their watches by him. He was the kind of man who is always at the synagogue before the reader begins and always helps fold the cloth over the scroll after the reading is finished. He was the kind of man who, when a neighbor needed help bringing in a harvest before the rain came, turned up at dawn with his own son to assist, except that he had no son, and so he turned up alone. He was, in the language of the old Jewish piety, one of the Anawim, one of the quiet ones in the land, the pious poor, the faithful remnant, the men and women who prayed the old psalms in their own small villages and waited for the consolation of Israel. And Elizabeth was his match, which is another way of saying she was a woman of the same kind. She was quiet in her faith and steady in her routines. She ground the flour for the Sabbath bread on Friday afternoon without being reminded. She kept the lamp trimmed. She remembered the feast days without having to consult the calendar. She knew the passages of the law that were read on each Sabbath of the year well enough that she could have recited along with the reader if she had been permitted to, which she was not, but the fact of her knowing them mattered to her in a quiet and private way. She was kind to the poorer women of the village who came to her for a little bread or a little oil when their husbands had lost a crop or fallen ill. She was gentle with the children of her neighbors, taking them on her lap and telling them the stories of Sarah and of Hannah in a voice that, if any of her neighbors had listened closely, had a certain tenderness in it that came from a grief she did not name. She was married to her husband in a way that is hard to describe in a paragraph, because some marriages are a matter of love letters and dramatic gestures, and others are a matter of 4 decades of shared silences at the breakfast table, and Zechariah and Elizabeth's marriage was the second kind. They were old now. They had lived together in the same stone house for longer than most of their neighbors had been alive. They knew each other's every small habit and every small irritation and every small kindness. They had no children. They would never have children. That was the stone they had learned to carry between them, like an old wound set so deep in the shared muscle of their marriage that it was just part of how they walked. A certain kind of modern reader, reaching this point, wants to soften the pain of it or to argue with it. A couple that loved each other and loved God, so the argument goes, did not really need a child for their happiness or their spiritual standing. Surely the Lord's favor rested on them regardless. Surely the community saw their goodness. And in a certain late and tidy sense, all of this is true. But it is not how the ancient world worked, and it is not how Zechariah and Elizabeth themselves would have experienced it, and to pretend otherwise is to rob them of the dignity of what they actually suffered. A woman in Judea in the closing years of the 1st century before Christ, who had gone through her childbearing years without a child, had been denied the one thing her whole culture told her she had been put on the earth to produce. There was a rabbinic ruling that a man who had been married to a woman for 10 years without children was permitted, even required in some interpretations, to divorce her and marry again in order to fulfill the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Some men did this. Many men, probably most men in those circumstances, did not, because 10 years of shared life was its own law, and because the heart is older than the commentaries. But the ruling existed, and Elizabeth would have known it existed, and every one of her married years past the 10th would have carried in the back of her mind the quiet awareness that her husband could, if he chose, set her aside for this. He never did. Not in the 12th year of their marriage, when the ruling might first have applied. Not in the 20th, not in the 30th, not ever. He loved her. He had loved her as a young bride, with her black hair loose under her veil, and he had loved her through the years of her waning hope, and he had loved her now that her hair was the color of limestone dust and her hands were as lined as his own. And that love, which is sometimes the only answer that any of us ever get to the ancient question of why a good person suffers, was the first and most unshakable fact about the household into which everything that was about to happen would descend. In the village, their childlessness was not treated cruelly. They were too old and too respected for that. But it was, nevertheless, a thing that the village knew. The mothers who brought their babies to the synagogue on the 8th day for circumcision knew, as they carried the wrapped infant past Zechariah's door, that he and his wife had never once made that walk themselves. The couples who came to him for counsel on a point of the law, as they sometimes did, knew that he had no living grandchildren to push forward on his knee for a blessing when they left. The old women who gossiped at the well, as old women have always gossiped at wells, knew the long history of hope and grief in Elizabeth's house, because it was not a history she had ever hidden. And at a certain age in a small village, there is no privacy for that kind of history anyway. The comments when they came were usually kind. A neighbor would say, "The Lord is her reward, even without a son of her own body," and mean it. An elder would say, "She is a mother to every child in this village," and mean it. But the kindness could not quite paper over the oddness of it. Here was a woman of the priestly line, married to a priest of the division of Abijah, righteous before God, keeping the law, and yet her womb had been closed her whole life long. The only theological grid the village had for such a thing kept pointing stubbornly towards the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. If righteousness was rewarded with children, and these two had been righteous for 70 years, where were their children? Either the grid was wrong, or the people were. And nobody in the village wanted to say that either the grid or the people were wrong, so mostly they said nothing at all. And the stone of the question sat in the middle of the village like the stone over the mouth of the old well that nobody quite wanted to move. Zechariah, for his part, had made his peace with it in the way that men of his sort make peace with things. He did not stop studying. He did not stop teaching. He did not stop making the journey up to Jerusalem twice a year for his division's week of service, even as the walk grew harder on his knees and the climb up the steps of the Temple Mount grew slower, and he had, more than once, to stop and catch his breath on the landing. He did what the Anawim have always done, which is to keep the routines of faith even when the expected reward of faith has not been delivered. He prayed the morning prayer. He prayed the evening prayer. He said the grace before his meals. He studied the law on the Sabbath afternoons. He bore the quiet grief of his house without ever, as far as anyone outside it could see, becoming a bitter man. This was, in its own way, an achievement, and an achievement of a kind that does not make history, except when history, every so often, makes a specific point of stooping down to notice it. And yet, underneath all of this, underneath the years of settled routine and accepted disappointment, Zechariah was still, at some level, a man whose name meant Yahweh remembers, whose wife's name meant the oath, whose whole family history on both sides ran back to the foot of Sinai and the cloud on the mountain, and the promises that had been cut into the hearts of his ancestors before they had been cut into the tablets of stone. He was a man whose prayers, even the ones he had given up asking in words, were being remembered in some place he could not see by someone who did not forget. He did not know this. He could not have known it. He was a tired old priest preparing to go up to Jerusalem for his twice-yearly duty, packing his linen into his pack, kissing his wife at the door of the house, setting out on the long, familiar walk down the path between the olive trees with a staff in his hand and a piece of bread and a skin of wine in his bag. Elizabeth watched him go from the doorway, as she had watched him go on this same errand perhaps 80 times before over the course of their long marriage, and she did not know either. She would return to her bread dough. She would return to the small tasks of the household. She would look up at the hills in the direction he had gone in a little while and say a quiet prayer for his safe return, as she always did. And then she would get on with her day, because life in a hill village does not stop for old women, even ones whose husbands have just set out on the most ordinary of journeys, which is about to become the least ordinary journey either of them has ever taken. The village, as he left it, was doing the things villages do in the high country of Judea on a spring morning in the closing years of the reign of Herod the Great. Children were already climbing the low stone walls between the terraces. Women were drawing water at the well. An old man was sharpening a scythe on a whetstone in his courtyard, spitting occasionally to keep the blade cool. The smell of bread was just beginning to rise off the cooking stones of 2 or 3 houses. A dog was barking at a goat that had wandered into the wrong garden. The hills stretched away into the distance, terraced and silver-leaved with olive, and the sky above them was the pale blue of a Judean spring that had not yet burned into the hard white of summer. None of these small domestic movements looked in any way like the beginning of a story. But the beginning of a story is almost never the part that looks like the beginning of a story. The beginning of a story, more often, looks like an old priest packing his bag for a routine errand, and an old woman watching him from a doorway with her hands dusted in flour. It looks like a man whose name means Yahweh remembers, walking out of his village without knowing he has been remembered. It looks like a woman whose name means the oath going back to her kitchen, without knowing the oath is about to come due. He had the long walk ahead of him, down out of the hills and into the city. He had the roll call at the chamber of hewn stone in the temple precincts, where the priests of each division reported in on the first day of their week. He had a week of duties to look forward to, some of them ordinary, one of them perhaps, by the grace of God and the fall of the lot, slightly more than ordinary. He was 70 years old, or thereabouts. He had done this for 4 decades. He expected nothing unusual. He expected, at the end of the week, to walk back out of Jerusalem through the same gate he had walked in, to climb the same path up into the hills, and to push open the same door of the same stone house that his Elizabeth would be standing in, with bread baked and water drawn waiting for him. That was how it had always been. That was how it would be again. He could not imagine, as he set off down the path, that he would come home from this particular week of temple duty unable to speak a single word. The road from the hill country down to Jerusalem was one of those old walking routes that had been trodden into the limestone by the sandals of pilgrims for so many centuries that the rock itself had grown smooth in the middle, and the weeds grew only at the edges. The path wound down through the terraced slopes and between the olive trees, crossing the dry beds of seasonal streams, climbing small rises and falling away into small valleys, opening occasionally onto vistas where the whole of the Judean highlands spread out beneath a hard blue sky and the white walls of distant villages caught the morning sun. Zechariah walked at the slow, steady pace of an old man who has made this journey more times than he can count. He leaned on his staff where the going was steep. He stopped in the shade of a carob tree in the middle of the day and ate a piece of bread and drank from a leather skin. He fell into step for a while with another priest from another village who was also on his way up for the division's week, an acquaintance of his from the periodic gatherings of the course of Abijah, and they exchanged the news of their respective towns, the small gossip of weddings and illnesses and the price of barley this year, the kind of walking talk that fills the hours of a pilgrimage and leaves almost no trace in the memory afterwards. By the time they came in sight of the city, the shadows were lengthening on the eastern hills, and Jerusalem was catching the light in that particular way it has at evening, when the walls turn rose and the temple platform floats above everything else, like an impossible white altar set upon the shoulders of the mountain. They came up the approach road with a small stream of other arrivals, priests and Levites from villages all over Judea, some riding donkeys with their packs tied behind them, most on foot as Zechariah was, all of them converging on the appointed week from every direction of the country. They passed through one of the gates. They made their way through the narrow upper streets, where the shopkeepers were beginning to close their stalls for the night, and the lamps in the upper windows were being lit one by one against the coming dark. They came at last to the southern approach to the Temple Mount, and they climbed the broad stone steps worn hollow in the middle by the feet of countless pilgrims before them, and they passed under the great colonnades and into the outer precincts of the temple complex, and they reported, as every priest beginning his week of service had reported for generations, to the officer of the division at the chamber of hewn stone. The chamber of hewn stone was a large rectangular room in the inner temple area where much of the administrative and judicial business of the temple was conducted. The Sanhedrin, the ruling council of 70 elders, sat there when it was in session. The priests on duty assembled there every morning before dawn. The tables and ledgers of the temple administration were kept there. Zechariah stood in that chamber as he had stood in it perhaps 80 times before, answered to his name from the roster of the course of Abijah, submitted to the brief physical examination that the regulations required of any priest about to serve at the altar, and was shown to the quarters where the priests of the division slept during their week of service. The priests on duty did not, as a rule, leave the temple precincts for the whole of their 7 days. They ate there, they slept there. They rose for the morning service before the first light of dawn, and kept the evening service into the dusk. They wore their own clothes in the off hours, and put on the linen garments of their office when their duties required it, changing in small side rooms set aside for the purpose. The whole routine was built around the rhythm of the daily sacrifices, the morning and the evening offering, which had been kept in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, and which went on in almost unbroken succession through every weekday and every Sabbath and every festival of the year. The rhythm worked like this because it helps to know. Before the first gray light showed above the Mount of Olives to the east, the priests of the division that was serving that week rose from their beds, washed themselves in the ritual pools under the temple platform, and gathered in the chamber of hewn stone for the first assembly of the day. The officer in charge of the course reminded them of their duties. The priests who had never yet served in certain capacities were instructed, and then, because there were always more priests present than duties to be performed, the lots were cast. There were 4 lots in the morning. The first lot determined which priest would clear the ashes from the great altar of burnt offering in the outer court and prepare a new pile of wood for the day's fires. The second lot determined which priests, 13 of them in all, would actually perform the slaughter of the morning lamb and the various attendant functions of that sacrifice, bringing the water for the washing, carrying the pieces of the lamb up the altar ramp, managing the flour and the oil and the wine of the grain and drink offerings that accompanied it. The third lot, the great lot, determined which single priest, of all the priests present, would have the honor of entering the holy place itself to offer the incense on the small golden altar inside, in front of the veil that hid the Holy of Holies. And the fourth lot determined which priest would perform certain of the final rituals, including the carrying of the pieces up the altar and the closing blessing. Of these 4 lots, the third was by an enormous margin the most coveted, for a reason that took a little explaining. The reason was this: the course of Abijah, like each of the 24 divisions, contained several hundred priests. Any one of them could be present for the morning assembly in a given week. Any one of them could, in principle, draw the lot for the incense offering. But the rabbinic tradition had long since ruled that a priest who had once offered the incense was not eligible to draw that lot again until every other priest of his division had had the opportunity to offer it. This rule had been made in the interests of fairness, to prevent the same handful of priests from cornering the most sacred of the daily duties for themselves. The unintended consequence of the rule, given the sheer number of priests in each division, was that most priests went their entire lives without ever being chosen. The odds simply did not support it. A priest served 1 week, twice a year, for perhaps 40 years of an active priestly life. In each week, the incense lot was drawn 14 times, morning and evening, across the 7 days. That gave a priest fewer than 1,000 opportunities across his whole career, competing in each drawing with dozens, sometimes 100 or more, of his colleagues, every one of whom, under the rule, had priority over anyone who had already offered. Statistically, a priest of the course of Abijah, who was ordinary in every respect, could expect to offer incense in the holy place perhaps once in his lifetime. Many priests never offered it at all. Most ended their careers with the small private grief of having served faithfully for decades without ever having crossed the threshold of the sanctuary itself. Zechariah had never crossed that threshold. 40 years of twice-yearly duty, 80 weeks of service across his whole life, and the lot had never fallen on him. He had watched it fall on other men, on younger men, on men he had trained himself. He had, no doubt, made his peace with the probability that it never would. A man who had made his peace with having no sons had long since learned how to make peace with smaller disappointments. He rose on this day in the early darkness, washed in the ritual pool, put on the clean white linen tunic and the linen breeches and the linen turban of his office, tied the embroidered sash about his waist, and walked with the other priests of his division across the pavement to the chamber of hewn stone to assemble for the lots. and the lot fell on him. That is the plainest way to say what happened, and the oldest way, and probably the best. The urn was passed among the assembled priests. The officer of the course put in his hand and drew out the token. He called the name. The name he called was Zechariah, son of such and such, of the course of Abijah. A little rustle went through the gathered men. The priests around him, men who knew him well, men who had served alongside him for years, turned to him and clasped his arms and embraced him because they understood, all of them, what had just fallen to him. The officer on his right and the officer on his left, the two who would assist him in the preparatory stages of the offering, stepped forward to accompany him. And Zechariah, an old man whose hair had gone the color of candle wax, who had never expected to be called, who had come up to Jerusalem this week as he had come up every other week, with no particular expectation that this week would be different from any of the others, found himself suddenly at the center of the most sacred small ritual of the daily service of the house of the Lord. He could not, by the rules of the thing, hurry. The rituals surrounding the incense offering were elaborate and unhurried, and everything had to be done in a particular order. First, the old ashes had to be cleared from the small golden altar inside the sanctuary, which was the duty of the priest assigned to the preparatory lot. That priest went in, swept the altar, came out. Then another priest brought in a censer of burning coals, taken from the great altar of burnt offering in the outer court, set them on the golden altar, and withdrew. And then Zechariah, with his two assistants, entered the holy place itself, carrying a small covered golden vessel of incense. On the threshold, the two assistants halted. One of them struck the great bronze gong, the Magnificat, whose sound could be heard as far away as Jericho, to signal to the whole temple and the whole city that the moment of the incense offering had arrived. Outside, in the court of Israel beyond the inner wall, and in the court of the women beyond that, and in the great outer court of the Gentiles beyond that, the entire congregation of worshippers present at that hour of the day fell silent and prostrated themselves, turning toward the sanctuary, and began the silent prayer that was supposed to rise with the smoke of the incense into the presence of God. Hundreds of people, thousands perhaps at that hour, knelt in the outer courts with their foreheads almost touching the pavement, their lips moving silently. The whole temple held its breath. Zechariah stepped across the threshold alone. His two assistants drew back and stayed outside. He walked forward into the holy place. The holy place, for anyone who has never stood in the imagination of it, was a long, narrow room about 30 cubits deep from the entrance to the inner veil, and 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits from the floor to the cedar ceiling overhead. It was plated everywhere in gold. The floor was cypress, the walls and the ceiling were cedar paneled with gold. The doors behind him, the doors through which he had just stepped, were gold. And the chamber was lit not by windows, for there were none, but by the soft burning flames of the great 7-branched golden lampstand, the menorah, which stood on the south side of the room and was fed daily with pure olive oil by the priests. On the north side of the room stood the table of the shewbread, piled high with the 12 loaves of unleavened bread that were renewed every Sabbath, representing the 12 tribes of Israel perpetually before the Lord, and beside it the small incense cups and the pitchers and the other vessels of the table's service. And directly ahead of him, in the middle of the room, just in front of the great inner veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies beyond, stood the small golden altar of incense, waist high, with the horns at its 4 corners and the coals glowing red on its top. Beyond that altar, behind the veil, was the innermost room of the whole of the sanctuary of Israel, the place where the Ark of the Covenant had once stood in Solomon's temple, the place where no man but the high priest entered, and he only once a year on the Day of Atonement. The Ark itself was not there now. It had been lost in the destruction of the first temple 5 centuries earlier, and the second temple's Holy of Holies was empty, so the rabbis taught, save for a single stone on which the high priest set the censer of incense on the Day of Atonement. but the presence behind the veil was not understood to be any less real for that. The Shekinah, the settled glory of the Lord, was taught to dwell there still, unseen, invisible, closer than any man could bear to know. And Zechariah, in the small lamplit chamber in front of that veil, was now standing closer to that presence than any man in the whole of Israel, except the high priest himself on one day a year. He was standing, in the old language, in the place where heaven and earth met most thinly, where the cloth between the worlds was stretched most tight. He was an old country priest alone in the presence of the Lord. He did what he had come to do. He uncovered the small golden vessel he was carrying. He took the incense in his hand, a compound of 11 spices prepared according to the formula in the book of Exodus, and he sprinkled it slowly and carefully onto the hot coals of the altar. The incense caught and began to smoke, and the smoke rose white and blue in the flickering lamplight and climbed toward the gilded cedar ceiling overhead, and the chamber filled with the fragrance that the Lord had said, in the old writings, was pleasing to him. Zechariah drew back a pace from the altar. He prostrated himself. He began, almost certainly, the silent prayer that every priest offered in that moment, a prayer whose words have not survived exactly, but whose substance was a petition for the peace of the temple and the blessing of Israel, and the coming of the consolation, and the return of the glory, and the forgiveness of the sins of the peace. People. It was the great concentrated moment of his whole priestly life. It was the one moment in which he, ordinary old Zechariah of the hill village, stood in the place of all Israel before the face of God. He had perhaps a few minutes. He had perhaps less. There would come a moment when he would have to rise, back slowly away from the altar, walk out again through the great doors, appear on the steps outside to pronounce the priestly blessing on the waiting congregation. Until then, he was alone with the Lord, except that he was not alone. He looked up, or perhaps opened his eyes, or perhaps simply became aware in that particular way that a man becomes aware of another presence in a room, of a figure standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Standing on the south side, between the altar and the great golden lampstand, standing so close that the flame of the lamps lit him at the edges and the smoke of the incense curled around his feet. A man, or rather the shape of a man, the proportions of a man, but everything about him was wrong, or rather everything about him was right in a way that no ordinary man was ever quite right. The stillness, the clarity of outline, the quality of light around him, the fact of him being there at all in a room into which no one but Zechariah himself was permitted to walk. Zechariah, who had spent his whole life in the careful study of the law and knew precisely who was and was not allowed on the sanctuary floor, understood in the first fraction of a heartbeat what he was looking at. Fear fell on him. The old text puts it exactly this way, as if fear were a physical thing, a weight that came down from above and pressed a man flat to the pavement. His knees turned to water. His hand went to his chest. He could not catch his breath. The incense was still rising from the altar. The lamps were still burning. The world was still in the shape it had always been in. And a messenger from the other side of that world was standing 5 feet away from him, regarding him with an expression he could not read. The messenger spoke. The voice, when it came, was not a voice like the voices of men. It was calm. It was clear. It carried the weight of authority without the weight of command. And its first word was the one word that every angelic voice in every apparition in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures had always begun with, the one word that suggested better than anything else how large the gap was between the two kinds of beings now sharing the room. "Fear not," the angel said. "Fear not, Zechariah, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John." The words must have landed on him like stones. His prayer was heard. Which prayer? The prayer he had just been praying, the great intercessory prayer of the incense offering for the consolation of Israel, which was the prayer every priest prayed at that altar as a matter of duty? Or the older prayer, the prayer he had given up praying decades ago, the private prayer of two old people in a stone house in the hill country for a son? The angel did not specify. Perhaps both. Perhaps, in the mysterious arithmetic by which the Lord hears prayers, they had always been the same prayer. But the answer, whichever prayer was being answered, was a son for him and for Elizabeth, a son in their old age, a son with a name already chosen, not by them, but by the one who had sent this messenger. The name was John. In the Hebrew, the name was Yohanan, and it meant, like all the great Hebrew names, what it said, which was that the Lord has been gracious. Zechariah was Yahweh remembers. Elisheba was the oath of God. And now the son whose coming had been announced in the smoke of the incense was to be called the Lord has been gracious. The three names, placed end to end, made a sentence. They made the sentence that had been waiting to be spoken for 4 centuries. The Lord remembers his oath and has been gracious. And the messenger went on. He did not stop with the Son. He gave the Son a life. Thou shalt have joy and gladness, he said, and many shall rejoice at his birth, for he shall be great in the sight of the Lord. He shall drink neither wine nor strong drink, and he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. And he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Each sentence was a bell struck in an old man's chest. Each sentence opened up into something larger. A son in their old age was one thing. A son dedicated to the Lord from the womb, set apart like a Nazarite from the first breath, was another thing. A son who would turn many in Israel back to their God was another thing again. And a son who would go before the face of the Lord himself, in the spirit and power of Elijah, to make ready a people prepared, was something altogether else, something that no ordinary country priest could have prepared himself to hear. Because the figure the messenger was describing with these words was a figure every pious Jew in the whole of Palestine had been waiting for and praying for and arguing about for centuries. The promise of Elijah, coming back before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, was the last promise of the last prophet of the Old Covenant. It was the single verse on which every Passover table in the land turned when the door was opened and the cup poured. And the messenger in the holy place was standing there calmly in the smoke of the incense, telling Zechariah that his own son, the son he had given up expecting, was the promised forerunner. His son was the one who would come in the spirit of Elijah. His son was the one who would make ready the people for the coming of the Lord. The old priest tried to take it in. He could not. He did what old men who have long since trained themselves to be careful about extraordinary claims do when an extraordinary claim is placed in front of them. He questioned it, not out of defiance, not out of anything like pride, out of the small, embarrassed, all too human arithmetic of a man whose body had grown old a long time ago, and whose wife's body had grown old with it. "Whereby shall I know this?" he said. "For I am an old man, and my wife well stricken in years." The question hung in the incense-thick air. It was a fair question, on its face. It was the question every pious Jew of his generation had been taught to ask when something remarkable was claimed. Show me the sign. Give me the token by which I may be sure. Abraham, when the Lord had promised him the land, had asked something very similar. Gideon had asked for his fleece. Hezekiah had asked for the shadow to go backward on the sundial. Asking for a sign was not, in the scriptures Zechariah had grown up on, always a sin. Sometimes it was counted as faith, but this time it was counted otherwise. The messenger's reply, when it came, was soft. but it carried a severity in it that the previous speech had not. "I am Gabriel," he said, "that stand in the presence of God, and I am sent to speak unto thee, and to show thee these glad tidings." That was the first time in almost 500 years that the name Gabriel had been spoken aloud in the land of Israel by the one who bore it. The name meant in the Hebrew, the mighty one of God, or the man of God, or the hero of God. Only twice in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures was any angel dignified with a name, and Gabriel was one of those two. The other was Michael, the prince who stood guard over the people of Israel. Gabriel had come to the prophet Daniel in the days of the Babylonian exile, 5 centuries earlier, to interpret a vision and then later to reveal the great and cryptic prophecy of the 70 weeks. And Gabriel had not spoken, as far as any prophet in Israel had recorded since then. Gabriel was not a messenger who was sent for small errands. Gabriel was the angel of the great hinges of sacred history, the announcer of the turning points, the voice at the pivot of epics. And Gabriel was standing in the holy place telling Zechariah personally that he had come from the presence of God, the actual presence, the inner court of heaven itself, specifically in order to bring this particular piece of news to this particular old priest in this particular chamber, and the old priest had responded by asking for a sign. The rebuke was gentle, but it was total. "And behold," Gabriel said, "thou shalt be dumb and not able to speak until the day that these things shall be performed, because thou believest not my words, which shall be fulfilled in their season." It happened as he said it. Zechariah felt the words inside his own mouth seize up. His tongue became a thing of stone in his jaw. He tried to draw breath and speak. No sound came. He tried again. Nothing. Something inside him that had been working for 70 years had stopped working, all at once, at the level of a switch. He could hear. He could think. He could form the words in his mind. But they would not come out. The mouth that had said the Shema every morning of his life since he was 4 years old. The mouth that had taught the law in his village synagogue. The mouth that had recited the priestly blessing over the heads of the congregation more times than he could count was sealed. He had asked for a sign. He had been given the sign. The sign was himself. When he looked up again, the altar was still smoking. The lamps were still burning on their 7-branch stand. The veil was still hanging on its rods before the Holy of Holies. But the place beside the altar was empty. The messenger was gone. He had gone as quietly and as completely as he had come, leaving no trace in the holy place except a faint disturbance of the incense smoke and a profound emptying of the space where he had stood. Zechariah was alone. He was alone in a way he had never been alone before. Not in the long evenings in the hill country with Elizabeth, and not in the longer nights of his priesthood. He was alone with the most extraordinary news any man in that generation of Israel had yet been given, and he could not speak it. He was alone with a commission whose full weight he had only just begun to understand, and his tongue was stone in his head. He stood in the holy place, an old country priest in a white linen tunic, with smoke rising from the altar in front of him, and the great veil hanging beyond it, and the whole congregation of Israel outside the doors, waiting for him to come out and pronounce the blessing, and he knew, with a cold and terrible clarity, that he was about to walk out of that room into the thick, golden light of the temple court and try to open his mouth and produce no sound at all. Outside those doors, the pavement of the inner court was full. It had always been full at the hour of the offering, but today, because he had tarried longer than the rituals allowed, the usual silence had begun to curdle into something else. The priests who had accompanied him to the threshold had stood waiting on the steps beyond the great curtain of the sanctuary doors, their eyes on each other, their hands clasped in front of them, their faces composed in the careful neutrality of men who were trying not to appear anxious. Behind them, in the court of Israel, the Jewish men in their prayer shawls had straightened from their prostrations and were looking up at the sanctuary doors, their lips still moving through the closing words of the silent prayer, but their eyes darting now to the men on the steps. Behind them, in the court of the women, the mothers and daughters and widows of Judea lifted their faces. Behind them, in the vast outer court of the Gentiles, pilgrims from every town and village of the country, and from every quarter of the diaspora, looked up from wherever they were kneeling and craned their necks toward the sanctuary, because the unease of a congregation is a thing that travels outward in rings like the ripple from a stone dropped into water, and within a few heartbeats every soul on the whole temple platform knew, without having to be told, that the priest of the evening incense had been in there too long. They did not want to think the worst. The old rabbinic stories about priests, struck down in the sanctuary for some hidden ritual error, were stories that every observant Jew had heard since childhood, and nobody in the crowd wanted to imagine, this evening, that one of those stories was about to be added to. The old tales were specific. A priest with something unconfessed on his conscience entered the holy place and did not come out. A priest with some impurity unaddressed fell dead at the altar. A rope had to be knotted round the ankle of the corpse, and the corpse dragged out from the threshold because no other priest was permitted to cross the line and carry him. These stories had the quality of distant thunder in the collective memory of the priesthood. They were almost never actually enacted in the lived experience of any living priest, but they hung in the air of the temple at any moment when a priest stayed inside too long, and the minutes were stretching now. Whatever they had been, they were past them. People in the crowd were murmuring. Women in the court of the women were pressing their hands to their mouths. A handful of the oldest priests, men who had seen 40 years of incense offerings come and go without incident, were quietly calculating in their heads how much longer they would wait before sending a man in with a rope. Then the doors moved. They moved slowly, with the slow, dignified creak of their great hinges, and the evening light that had been slanting across the court suddenly lengthened through the opening and met the warm firelight from the menorah and the rising smoke from the altar in a bright and complicated confusion. A figure stepped out onto the threshold. It was Zechariah. He was alive. He was standing. He was whole. The sigh of relief that went through the congregation was almost audible, a soft collective release of breath from several thousand throats. He was alive. But something was wrong. He stood on the threshold, and he did not speak. He did not raise his hands in the first gesture of the priestly blessing to shoulder height. He did not draw breath to pronounce the old familiar words that every Jewish child in the land had heard for 6 centuries and could recite before they could read. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Those words were what he was supposed to deliver now. Those words were the point. The whole congregation had knelt and prayed for the long minutes of the incense, offering precisely so that the priest, emerging, might lay those words upon them from the threshold, like an old and trusted hand laid on a child's head. He did not pronounce them. He stood there, white as the linen he was wearing, his eyes moving from face to face in the inner court, his mouth working, and no sound came out. No sound at all. The first face to understand was an old man in the court of Israel, a man who had been coming up to this evening service for 50 years and knew how a priest stood when the blessing was about to come and how a priest stood when something had happened to him. The old man's mouth dropped open. He tapped the arm of the man next to him. The second man looked. The realization spread outward from them through the crowd, in the same kind of rippling silence that the unease had moved in 5 minutes earlier. Only now the silence was of a different weight entirely. This was not the silence of people afraid a priest had died. This was the silence of people who had just watched a priest walk out of the holy place, struck dumb. and who knew, every one of them, without needing to be told, what such a thing had to mean. Zechariah tried to gather himself. He could not give them the words, but he could give them something. He raised his hands. He moved them in the slow shapes of the blessing, without the syllables, and the congregation, understanding, bowed their heads as they would have bowed for the syllables. He drew his hand across his mouth and shook his head. He pointed back over his shoulder at the sanctuary behind him. He made with his hands the gesture of wings, or the gesture of a great and shining figure, or the gesture of something that no ordinary gesture could quite catch. The old men on the front row of the court of Israel nodded slowly. The priests behind him on the steps exchanged looks. A word began to move through the crowd, a word that had not moved through a Jewish crowd in Jerusalem for the whole living memory of anybody present. The word was vision. He had seen a vision in the holy place. He had seen something. A man does not come out of the sanctuary struck dumb for nothing. A priest does not lose his voice in the presence of the altar of incense without a reason. The old prophetic silence that had been lying over the country for 4 centuries had been broken, somewhere in that lamplit chamber behind those doors, and the man who had broken it was standing on the threshold, unable to speak a single word about what he had seen. The congregation murmured and stared. Their service of prayer continued. The attendant priests came up the steps to help him down. And the whole temple, from the inner court to the court of the Gentiles, was alive for the rest of that evening with the rumor of something that nobody had quite seen, but that everybody, by the end of an hour, had heard. He did not go home. That is worth pausing on. A man struck dumb in the course of his duties might have been expected to withdraw, to retire to his quarters, to send a message to his village that his service had been cut short. Zechariah did not do this. He stayed. He completed the 7 days of his division's week, as the rules required and as his own sense of duty demanded. He continued, with the help of his brother priests, to perform such of his duties as did not require speech. He carried the wood. He managed the water. He attended at the altar of burnt offering in the outer court. He put on and took off the linen of his office at the appointed times, rose before dawn with the other priests of his division, ate the priest's portion of the sacrifices with them in the common rooms. He simply did not speak. When another priest addressed him, he inclined his head and gestured back with his hands. When questions were put to him about what he had seen, he shook his head slowly and laid a finger across his lips and pointed, always, up toward the sanctuary, as if to say, "What I saw is not for me to make the common property of any gossip in the outer court." The other priests came to understand that whatever had happened to him in the holy place was a thing of such weight that he was not going to try to convey it by signs in a dormitory. Whatever it was would wait until his tongue was loosed again, or it would wait forever. His week closed. The 7th evening came. Another division, the course of Jeshua perhaps, or Shechaniah, or one of the other 22, began its preparations to take over. Zechariah performed the final rituals of his week, handed his duties to his successor, changed out of his linen tunic for the last time, folded it carefully, packed it back into the cloth in which he had carried it, and set out on the long walk back up into the hill country of Judea. He went alone this time. The priest from the other village who had walked down with him at the beginning of the week was still on duty somewhere. A few of the men of his own division fell in with him for the first stretch out of the city, but their roads diverged at the first branching of the path, and he walked on by himself. The sun was behind him now, over the low western hills. The road ahead of him ran east and north, up into the limestone heights. He had the same staff, the same sandals, the same cloak. He was not the same man. How do you walk home from that? The question will have to be asked of the long road itself, because he did not answer it in words to anyone. He walked. He put one foot in front of the other. The small slopes up and the small slopes down, the dust on his sandals, the salt of his own dried sweat in his beard, the bread in his bag, which he ate when he stopped to rest, the water from the skin, which tasted of the leather it had been in all week, the ordinary small sensations of a country walk, which had for 70 years been the accompaniment of ordinary small thoughts, were the accompaniment now of the single enormous thought that he could not stop thinking and could not tell anyone. He turned it over in his head. He prayed silently the prayers he could no longer say aloud. He looked up at the blue of the sky, which was the same blue he had known all his life, and it looked different. He looked at the terraces of olives coming into their new leaf, which were the same terraces he had walked between 100 times, and they looked different. A man who has seen what Zechariah had seen does not come home the same as he left. He comes home carrying the inside of the holy place inside his chest, and every ordinary thing he looks at on the walk seems, for the first time, to be a thin and trembling veil over something far larger. And there was Elizabeth to think of. He had left her 5 mornings ago, or 6, at the door of their stone house in the dawn light, with her hands dusty in flour and her eyes gentle on him. He had walked down the path. She had watched him go. She had spent the week in her usual rhythms, grinding grain, drawing water, tending the small garden behind the house, going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, talking at the well with the other women of the village, all of them speaking, as they always did, about the small weather of daily life, about the lambs, and the oil, and the illnesses, and the weddings, and the coming of the new season. She had not the faintest inkling in any of those hours that anything out of the ordinary had happened to her husband in Jerusalem. She was waiting for him to come back. She was going to greet him at the door, with bread she had baked, and a cup of wine she had drawn, as she had greeted him perhaps 80 times before at the end of 80 weeks of service. And when he arrived, he would not be able to speak. He would open his mouth at the threshold of his own house to greet the woman he had loved for 40 or 50 years, and no sound would come out of it. He came over the last rise in the hill country and saw the familiar roofs of his village in the afternoon light, the stones of his own house, the olive tree by the courtyard wall, the one that had been planted by his grandfather and was older than he was, the small curl of cooking smoke rising from the hearth, and there in the doorway, as he came up the path, a figure in a plain brown shawl who had seen him while he was still a long way off and had begun to walk toward him along the garden, her hands still dusted with the flour of the afternoon's baking, her face wearing the ordinary glad welcome of a wife who has been waiting all week for the return of her husband and is now about to have her ordinary reward for the waiting. She came up to him on the path, and she saw his face, and she stopped. That was all. She stopped. Elizabeth was a woman of the priestly line, who had been married to a priest for the whole of her adult life, and she was not a woman who ignored the expression on her husband's face when he came home from Jerusalem. Something had happened. Something had happened to him in the temple. She looked at him in the long silence of the path, in the afternoon light, in the shadow of their own olive tree, and he looked back at her, and he tried to speak, and he could not. He put his hand to his mouth. He shook his head. He took her hand in his other hand and squeezed it gently and pressed it against his lips and shook his head again. She understood, in the way that a woman who has been married to a man for 50 years can understand even without words, that her husband was mute. Then she understood, in another way and a deeper one, that he was mute because he had seen something. Then she understood, in a third way which was deeper still, that whatever he had seen was something that concerned her. He was pointing, as he had pointed on the temple threshold, but this time he was not pointing at the sanctuary. He was pointing at her belly, at the womb that had been closed for all of her 60 or 70 years and had been at the quiet center of all of her grief. And he was pointing up toward heaven, and he was pointing back at himself, and he was nodding slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man trying to say one true thing with the only language he had left. They walked the rest of the way to the house together. It was a short walk. She took his hand. Neither of them said anything, because one of them could not, and the other of them had nothing to say yet that was adequate to the moment. They crossed the threshold. He sat down on the low bench by the hearth. She brought him the cup of wine she had prepared, and a piece of the bread she had baked, and a bowl of warm water in which to wash the dust off his feet from the road. And she knelt and washed his feet, as she had done for half a century, with her hands as careful on the old skin of his ankles as they had been on the young skin. And when she was finished, she looked up at him, and she held his hands in hers, and she waited, not for him to speak, because he could not, but for whatever it was that would come next. What came next was probably some form of silent communication, the kind that old couples learn, the kind that depends on very few signs to convey very much. There may have been some rudimentary writing. There may have been only gestures. Whichever it was, by the end of that first evening in their stone house, by the time the lamps had been lit and the small meal eaten and the door closed against the evening wind off the hills, Elizabeth knew, in rough outline, what her husband had seen. She knew he had been chosen at last for the incense. She knew he had gone into the holy place. She knew something had met him there. She knew the word son had been spoken over her, and that the son was not a general hope, but a specific promise, and that the son already had a name, and that the name was John. She knew, or she came to know in the course of the days that followed, that this son was to grow into a figure of weight in the long history of Israel, and that he was to come in the spirit and power of the old prophet Elijah. She knew, too, that she herself was not young, that neither was he, and that the thing which had been promised was at the edge of the impossible. And she bore all of this in silence, because her husband was in silence, and the house was in silence, and there was, at the heart of it, a large and holy quiet that neither of them wanted to fill yet with the ordinary chatter of a normal life. And then, in the days that followed, Elizabeth conceived. The old text puts it very plainly. After those days, it says, his wife Elizabeth conceived. The words are short and dry, the way the scriptures often are, at the turning points where a less honest writer would have put in a paragraph of description. A conception is a private thing, and the scriptures respect the privacy. They do not describe it. They do not linger on it. They simply record that it happened. An old woman who had been barren her whole life lay down with her old husband in the stone house in the hill country, and the womb that had been closed for 60 years was opened. A small cell found another small cell in the dark of the old woman's body, and the two of them became one, and the one became many, and the many began to grow, and the thing that was growing was a new human being, and the human being had a name already written into the purposes of heaven, and the name was John. Elizabeth knew when she knew. Every woman who has ever been pregnant will tell you that there is a moment, long before the outward signs begin, when a woman knows in her own body what has happened. It is not a thing she can prove to anyone else. It is not a thing she can always even argue for. But she knows. Elizabeth knew. There came a morning when she stood in her kitchen, grinding the grain for the day's bread, and stopped, one hand on the small stone mill, the other on the curve of her abdomen, and understood what was happening. She was 60-something years old. Her body had not done this in her whole life, and it was doing it now. The text does not describe this moment. It only tells us that after she conceived, she hid herself 5 months. Those 5 months will have to be imagined, because no angel recorded them, and no scribe transcribed them, and the woman who lived them did not speak of them in any way that has come down to us, except in one short and astonishing sentence at the end of the 5 months, which we will come to. Why did she hide? There are reasons and reasons she hid, in part because the thing that was happening to her body was too strange to expose yet. A woman of her age, who announced herself pregnant to her village, would have been met at first with quiet disbelief, and then, as the truth became undeniable, with a storm of attention she was not yet ready to endure. She hid in part because she wanted to be sure. She had lived her whole life in the shadow of disappointment. She was not going to come out of her house and tell the women of the well that she was at last, at this impossible age, going to bear a son, only to have the small flutter in her body reveal itself to be some illness or some late embarrassment of her old flesh. She waited until there could be no mistake. She wanted the fact to be unmistakable before she would submit it to other eyes. She hid in part because the thing was holy, and she was a woman of the priestly line who had spent her whole life learning that holy things are to be handled carefully, that they are not to be taken up into the daylight too soon, that the coals of the altar are brought into the sanctuary in a covered vessel and not waved about in the open air. Whatever was happening inside her was her body's own holy place, and for 5 months she drew a veil around it and would not let anyone look behind. She hid above all because she wanted to ponder. A woman who has been told by the silent gestures of her mute husband that she is carrying the promised forerunner of the Lord has some thinking to do. A woman who has been barren for 60 years and has now at the edge of her life been given the one thing she had long ago stopped asking for has some feeling to do. She needed the 5 months. She took them. Her village noticed that something was different. Of course. Villages always notice. Elizabeth stopped coming to the well at the busy hour. She stopped coming to the synagogue quite as regularly as she had. She let one of the younger women of the village do her errands in the market. She kept indoors. Her door was open to friends who came to visit, but she herself did not go out much, and when friends did come, she received them with her usual kindness, but redirected conversation away from herself. Her old husband was silent at her side. Her household was, to the puzzled eye of anyone who peered in, precisely the kind of quiet, ordered, slightly withdrawn place that it had always been, only quieter and more withdrawn. Some of the older women of the village, who knew her best, understood that something was happening without knowing what. A few of them may even have guessed, because women who have raised their own children have eyes for the small changes in the bodies of other women, and Elizabeth's body was beginning to change. But nobody asked directly, and Elizabeth, for those 5 months, did not directly answer. What she did in those months, the old text tells us in a single sentence, a sentence that deserves to be taken apart word by word, because she clearly spent those months putting it together in her own heart before she would let it out of her mouth. "Thus hath the Lord dealt with me," she said, "in the days wherein he looked on me, to take away my reproach among men. Thus hath the Lord dealt with me." The verb she used was the verb used in the old scriptures for the Lord's decisive action, the verb used when the Lord had dealt with Sarah in her old age, the verb used when the Lord had dealt with Hannah in her barrenness, the verb used when an impossible door had been opened by a hand that no human agency could ever have set against it. She knew her scriptures. She knew whose verbs she was borrowing. She placed herself, in her quiet hidden house, in the long line of women whose wombs had been opened, when everyone had long since given up, hoping for them to be opened. In the days wherein he looked on me, this was the phrase that would have broken her if she had said it out loud. To look upon, in the language of her people, was not a casual glance. It was a considered, directed, attentive regard. The Lord had looked upon her, not at her in the way that a king might glance at a beggar in the street, but upon her in the way that a father bends his whole attention down upon a child. He had looked upon her, in her stone house in the hill country, in her old grief, in her quiet. He had turned his face, not away but toward. And the days in which he had looked on her were the days that had just happened, The days of her conception, the days of the opening of her womb, the days in which something had begun in her that had never, in all her decades of waiting, ever been possible before. To take away my reproach among men. There it was, the word that she had carried under her tongue for her whole adult life. Reproach, the shame. The quiet, constant, ordinary shame of being a barren woman in a community where fertility was the sign of favor and the shadow of infertility fell across every conversation and every festival meal. She had not been cruel to the women of her village who had borne children. She had been, as far as anyone could tell, gracious. But she had carried the reproach anyway, and she had carried it for a long time, and she had carried it, for the most part, alone. And now, in the 5 months of her hiddenness, in the slow changing of her body, in the private certainty that grew week by week, the reproach was being taken away, not by her achievement, not by her prayer, not even now by her expectation, for she had long since stopped expecting, by the Lord who had looked upon her in the days that had just passed and had decided, for reasons that belonged to Him and not to her, to take it away. Her song, if it was a song she sang to nobody but herself and the walls of her house, and perhaps the silent husband who sat by her in the evening and watched her with his old eyes. It was a song she worked over, phrase by phrase, for the whole of the 5 months, turning it in her mouth, feeling the weight of each of its words. Thus hath the Lord dealt with me in the days wherein He looked on me, to take away my reproach among men. She said it to the rising dough. She said it to the cooking fire. She said it under her breath as she walked from the hearth to the water jar in the corner of the room. She said it at dawn when she woke, and at dusk when she lay down. And each time she said it with less disbelief and more wonder, until by the end of the 5 months, the disbelief had gone out of it altogether, and the sentence had become the one settled fact around which the rest of her life now arranged itself. The body was changing by then, unmistakably. The waist had gone. The fullness had come. The quiet motion in her abdomen, which had been a question for the first weeks, and then a possibility, and then a rumor, was now a fact. The child was there. The child was growing. The child had a name that had been given to him before he had had a shape. She laid her hand on the curve of her own body in the evenings, in the low lamplight of the stone house, with her old husband sitting silent at the other end of the bench, and she felt the small fact of a life that had been denied her for 6 decades, and she was not afraid, and she was not any longer even surprised. She was simply quiet. She was quiet, in the way a woman is quiet when she is holding a thing she has long stopped hoping for, and is only now, slowly, beginning to believe she is actually allowed to keep. The 5 months ran toward their end. The 6th month was coming. The village was beginning, at last, to understand that something quite impossible had happened in the house of the old priest and his barren wife. The rumor was moving in the community, the slow way rumors move in hill villages, from the women at the well to the elders in the synagogue. And somewhere, far to the north, in another country altogether, in a little town that nobody in Jerusalem paid much attention to, a figure Elizabeth did not yet know she had a kinswoman in, was about to be visited by the same angel who had stood beside the altar of incense in the holy place. And the hiddenness of her 5 months was about to be interrupted. After all, by a knock at the door she could not have seen coming. The town was called Nazareth. It sat on the southern slopes of one of the low ridges of the region the Jews called Galilee, a rolling upland of wheat fields and olive groves and scattered limestone villages that formed the northern half of the ancient kingdom of Israel. Nazareth itself was tiny, perhaps 400 souls at most, a cluster of white houses with flat roofs tucked into the curve of a hillside above a small spring. The Hebrew scriptures did not mention it. The prophets had never spoken of it. No king had ever lived there. No priest had ever come from it. It was the sort of place the people of Jerusalem, when they thought of it at all, thought of with a small, dismissive smile. The Galileans as a whole had a reputation in the south for being provincial, uneducated, a little slow of speech, too close to the Gentile cities on the coast and in the Decapolis to be quite theologically reliable. And Nazareth, even within Galilee, was regarded as nothing much. A later voice, in this same story, coming upon Nazareth for the first time, would put the sentiment into words that have echoed down 20 centuries. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was the common wisdom. The common wisdom, as it so often is, was about to be made to look extremely foolish. In one of those 400 houses, on some ordinary spring afternoon in the 6th month of a pregnancy that Elizabeth was by this time concealing in the hill country of Judea, a young woman was going about her work. Her name, in the Hebrew of her parents and the Aramaic of her daily speech, was Mariam, which the Greek writers rendered as Maria and the Old English translators gave us as Mary. The name carried a family history inside it, because Mariam was also the name of the sister of Moses. The girl who had watched her infant brother drift downriver in a basket of reeds, and then gone on to become a prophetess in her own right, and to lead the women of Israel in their song of victory at the Red Sea. A name like that, given to a daughter of Israel, meant that the parents who gave it were hoping their daughter would grow into something of the same spirit. They could not have known, when they gave it, quite how far that hoping would carry. She was young. How young the Scriptures do not exactly say, but the customs of her time would place a betrothed girl somewhere between 12 and 16 at the earliest edge of womanhood, old enough to be promised to a husband and too young, by our reckoning, for almost anything else. She was betrothed to a man named Joseph. Joseph was a carpenter in Nazareth, a working man with calloused hands and the thick forearms of a life spent shaping wood. A man descended, his own family genealogy claimed, from the royal line of David, which meant that he carried in his veins the blood of the great king of Israel, and also, more recently, the blood of the long string of kings after him, who had been lesser men and lesser rulers, and had ended in the exile that broke the whole dynasty apart. By the time of Joseph and Mary, the royal line of David was a memory held in the small bronze genealogical rolls of the village, and had no practical force in the politics of Galilee or Judea. Joseph was not going to be crowned. The house of David was not on the throne, but the blood was the blood, and the book said what the book said. And when the elders of Nazareth recited the pedigrees of their families on the festival days, Joseph's name came out of a line that ran back through the tidy Hebrew generations, to the shepherd boy of Bethlehem who had killed the giant with a slingshot and composed the Psalms. Mary and Joseph had been betrothed, but not yet married. Betrothal in the Judaism of that time was not an engagement in any modern sense. It was a formal legal bond, closer to a marriage than to anything we would call a promise to marry. A betrothed woman belonged to her betrothed, legally and socially. If he died before the marriage, she was regarded as a widow. If she were unfaithful during the betrothal, she could be put to death for adultery. The only thing betrothal did not include was the actual cohabitation in one house, which followed later at the formal ceremony. Mary and Joseph had crossed the first threshold of their life together, but not yet the second. She was still living in her parents' house. She was still a virgin. She was, in the language of her community, his and not yet his. On the afternoon we are thinking of, she was alone, or at any rate alone enough to be startled by what happened. Perhaps she was at her loom. Perhaps she was grinding flour on the small household mill. Perhaps she was fetching water from the spring at the bottom of the hill with a clay jar on her hip. The old painters would set the scene in a dozen different ways, each according to his own century's imagination, and each of them would be guessing, because the Scriptures do not specify. What the Scriptures do specify is that a messenger came in, the same messenger who had come into the holy place in the Temple of Jerusalem 6 months earlier. Now, by whatever mysterious geography governs the movements of such beings, stood in a small village house or in a small village street in a backwater of Galilee, and addressed a teenage girl by name. "Hail," he said, "thou that art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women." That was the greeting. It was a greeting, and yet it was more than a greeting. It contained claims about her standing with God that no angel of heaven had ever, in the whole recorded history of Israel, directed at an ordinary young woman in a Galilean village. The mother of Moses had not been addressed by heaven in this way. The mother of Samuel had not been addressed in this way. Mary, who knew her scriptures as well as any village girl of her day, and better than most, cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. She did not fall down in an ecstatic swoon. She did not embrace the messenger. She did the thing a serious young woman does when she hears something extraordinary. She thought about it. She turned it over. She weighed the words. She was troubled, the text says, by the greeting, which is a careful and respectful way of saying that she was not sure whether to be afraid or flattered or suspicious or all three at once. The messenger, whose name she did not yet know, saw her confusion. The angels of the Scriptures, when they speak to human beings, almost always begin by calming them down before they come to their point, because the point, when it comes, is always enormous, and there is no useful conversation with a human being who has fallen on her face in terror. "Fear not, Mary," he said. He called her by her name. "For thou hast found favor with God." And he went on. What he said next would change her whole life, and, through her life, the whole shape of history. She was going to conceive in her womb, he said, and bring forth a son, and she was to call his name Jesus. In the Hebrew, the name was Yeshua, which meant, as every Hebrew-speaking child in Nazareth knew, the Lord saves. It was not an unusual name. Many Jewish boys in Galilee had been called it, and many more would be. There was nothing in the name alone to warn her. It was the sentences that followed the name that began the warning. "He shall be great," the messenger said, "and he shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there shall be no end." Her father David. He had said it without explanation, as if she were supposed to know, and she did know, because she was betrothed to a man of the house of David, and because the child she was being told she would bear would, through that father, inherit the dynasty, the throne of David, the house of Jacob, a reign that would not end. No reasonable ear listening to those phrases in any Galilean village in that generation could have missed what they meant. The messenger was describing the Messiah. He was describing, with the specific vocabulary of the old prophecies, the long-awaited King of Israel, the son of David who had been promised in the Psalms and in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, the son who would sit on David's throne and judge the peoples and bring in the reign of righteousness that every pious Jew prayed for every morning and every evening. That son was, according to this strange, clear voice speaking in her kitchen or her courtyard or wherever she was, now to be hers. She did the thing that made her, in a certain way, the spiritual kinswoman of the old priest in the hill country, whose name she had not yet heard. She asked a question, but she did not ask it the way the old priest had asked his. She did not ask by what sign she would know the thing. She did not challenge the promise or argue with its plausibility. She asked, instead, a practical and almost bodily question. "How shall this be," she said, "seeing I know not a man?" The phrase was a Hebrew idiom, a gentle and ordinary way of saying that she was a virgin. She was betrothed, yes, but she and her betrothed had not yet come together, and the promise being made to her was a promise of a child. She was not doubting whether God could do it. She was, rather, seeking the mechanics of it. In the space of a breath, she was asking the messenger to explain not whether, but how. The messenger explained. "The Holy Spirit," he said, "shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God." The verb was overshadow. It was the verb that described the cloud of the glory of the Lord coming down upon the tabernacle in the wilderness. the cloud that had settled over the mercy seat in the original meeting between Moses and the God of Israel. The same cloud, the same shadow, the same settling presence was now to be laid upon a young woman's body in a Galilean village. And the thing conceived there was not to be the conception of any earthly father, but of the Most High himself, a child born of a woman, without the participation of any man, because the child's conception was to come from the same Spirit that had hovered over the waters at the beginning of the world and had fallen on the tabernacle and the temple and the prophets and, once, 5 centuries earlier, on a captive boy named Daniel, who had written down strange prophecies about weeks of years. And then the messenger gave her the sign she had not asked for. "Behold," he said, "thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. For with God nothing shall be impossible." The words fell into Mary's hearing like a small key turning in a hidden lock. Elizabeth. Her kinswoman in the hill country of Judea, the older cousin she had grown up hearing about but had rarely seen, the good and righteous wife of the priest of the course of Abijah. Elizabeth, whose name in Hebrew meant the oath of God, and who had been married for decades without bearing children, Elizabeth was pregnant. Elizabeth, at whatever impossible age she had now reached, had conceived a son, 6 months along. The messenger did not elaborate. He did not need to. He had given her a sign, and he had given her a kinswoman to visit, and he had given her a living human proof that the God who was proposing to do an impossible thing in her own body had already begun doing an impossible thing in the body of a woman she was related to, less than 100 miles to the south. Mary's answer when she gave it was a single sentence, and it would be repeated in the prayers of 100 generations. "Behold," she said, "the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word." She did not argue. She did not bargain. She did not ask for time to consult with her parents or with her betrothed. She made her submission plain, and she made it in the language of a woman who had been raised to know who she was and who she answered to, and the answer was, "The Lord, the handmaid, the servant. Be it unto me according to thy word." The messenger, having delivered what he had come to deliver and received what he had come to receive, departed from her. The room was empty again, or the courtyard, or the place at the spring. The small sounds of the village came back into focus. The clucking of chickens, the distant voice of a neighbor calling a child in from play. And Mary stood alone, a young woman of Nazareth, who a minute before had been an ordinary village girl betrothed to an ordinary carpenter, and who was now, at some level she had only begun to understand, the mother of the one the prophets had spent 1,000 years pointing toward. She did not wait. The text is clear on this. She arose in those days, it says, and went into the hill country with haste to a city of Judah. She was not given an address. She was not given a map, but she knew where Elizabeth lived, the way a woman knows where her kinswomen live, because these things were passed along in the long conversations at the well and in the family gatherings at the pilgrim festivals. Elizabeth's husband was a priest. His village was somewhere in the hills south of Jerusalem. That was enough direction for a determined young woman to follow, and she did follow it. She would not have gone alone. A young Jewish girl in the 1st century did not travel the roads of Palestine by herself. The roads were not safe. Bandits worked the lower passes. Roman patrols might stop any solitary traveler for questioning. Samaritans and Jews did not always deal kindly with one another on the shared stretches of the north-south highway. A young woman traveling alone would have been exposed at almost every stage of the journey to the possibility of harm. So she will have gone with a caravan, or with a family, or with a party of pilgrims heading south for a coming festival, or with some combination of these things, because that was how young women of her station got from one end of the country to the other, and because her own mother and father would not have let her leave otherwise. The journey itself, by any of the routes a traveler could take, was a long one. From Nazareth in the lower hills of Galilee to the hill country of Judea south of Jerusalem was something like 80 to 100 miles, depending on which road a party of pilgrims chose to follow. The most direct route ran south through the hill country of Samaria, past the old city of Shechem and the ancient well where Jacob had once watered his flocks. That route was shorter, but less popular with pious Jews, because the Samaritans, those Jewish half-cousins descended from the mixed population of the old northern kingdom, held theological and historical grudges against their southern neighbors that sometimes boiled over into hostility on the road. The longer but safer alternative was to go east, down into the Jordan Valley, and then follow the great caravan road south along the eastern bank of the river through Perea, and then cross back over the Jordan at the traditional fording place near Jericho, and climb up from Jericho through the steep switchback ascents into the hills of Judea. 4 days of walking, or 5, or more if the party was slow. She will have carried only what she could carry on her back: a small bundle of her own things, a little food, a change of clothes. She will have slept in the open, or in the tents of the party she was with, or in the rough inns that stood at the regular stations of the road, places with a common room for the men and a curtained corner for any women traveling with them. She will have watched the landscape change as she went, the rolling green of Galilee giving way to the drier and browner country of Samaria, and then the sharp drop into the Jordan Valley and the oppressive heat of the rift, and then the hard climb up into the limestone of Judea, where the air was thinner and the light was whiter, and the whole character of the country was older and drier and more austere. And all the while, under her linen tunic, in a body that had been her own for the whole of her short life and was now not quite her own any more, something had begun. She will have thought much on that walk. A young woman going south to see an older kinswoman on an errand of the kind she was on was a young woman with a great deal to think about. She was betrothed to a man who did not yet know she was pregnant. She was pregnant with a child whose conception she could not explain to any person in the world who had not heard the words of the messenger. She was traveling alone among strangers with the secret of it under her clothes. And the secret was not a thing of the kind a woman was supposed to ponder on a long walk. It was the thing itself, the center of every prophetic voice that had ever sung in her people, folded up now into the small human being taking shape in her body. She went with haste, the text says. That word carries everything. She did not stroll. She did not linger at the way stations. She pushed ahead through the heat and the dust and the anxiety, because the sign the messenger had given her was waiting for her in a stone house in a hill village, and she wanted, very badly, to see it with her own eyes. The village, when she came to it, was much like the one she had left. Smaller, perhaps, set higher in the hills, stone walls, flat roofs, terraced olives, a narrow path between the houses. She will have asked at the well or at the edge of the village for the house of the priest Zechariah, and the women drawing water there will have pointed the way. She will have climbed up between 2 low walls to a door in a familiar kind of house, a door she had never before crossed, and she will have stood on its threshold, dusty from the road, young, heavy with what she was carrying, and she will have lifted her voice in the customary greeting of an arrival. It was a greeting, nothing more. The old Jewish greeting between women, the shalom spoken across a threshold, the familiar exchange of 100 daily village encounters. But when her voice reached the ears of the woman inside the house, a thing happened that had never happened in the long recorded history of any greeting ever spoken between any 2 women. The child in Elizabeth's womb leapt. He leapt. That is the word the text uses. Not moved, not stirred, not turned. Leapt. The word suggests something violent and joyful, the kind of movement a child makes in a mother's womb when it is overcome by something it cannot yet articulate, and will not, in fact, articulate for another 30 years. The old priest's son, at 6 months' gestation, in the dark of his mother's body, in the quiet of the stone house in the hill country, heard the voice of the young cousin at the door, and responded to it in the only way a child of his age could respond, which was with a great and jubilant vault of the whole of his small being against the inside of his mother's body. Elizabeth felt it. She felt it the way a mother feels, every movement of the child she is carrying, and she knew, at the exact moment she felt it, that this particular movement was not like the others. This was recognition. This was her son recognizing something or someone. And as soon as that thought entered her mind, the same Holy Spirit who had been given to the child in her womb, the Spirit the messenger had said would fill him from the first, fell also upon the mother, and Elizabeth, 6 months pregnant, old enough to be the young woman's grandmother, spoke out in a loud voice that filled the small house. "Blessed art thou among women," she said, "and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. And whence is this to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For, lo, as soon as the voice of thy salutation sounded in mine ears, the babe leaped in my womb for joy. And blessed is she that believed. For there shall be a performance of those things which were told her from the Lord." Consider what had just happened in that doorway. Elizabeth had not been told by any human being who Mary was carrying. She had not been written to. No messenger from Nazareth had come ahead. She had not even had time to greet her cousin properly. She had heard the voice of a young woman at her door, and in the very hearing of it, the child inside her had leapt, and the Spirit of the Lord had fallen on her, and out of her mouth had come not a word of polite welcome, but a prophecy. She had called the young woman on her doorstep the mother of her Lord. She had called the fruit of her womb blessed. She had recognized, without being told, that the girl who had climbed the hill path to her house was carrying the one the messenger of the holy place had said her own son would go before. One Spirit had spoken over one son in one temple, and now the same Spirit was speaking over another son in another house, and the two sons, though neither had yet been born, had just greeted each other across the fabric of their mother's bodies. Mary did not correct her. She did not say, "Oh no, you have misunderstood." She did not say, "Let me explain." She did what she had done when the messenger had come to her in Nazareth. She made her answer in a song. She opened her mouth, this young woman still dusty from the road, this teenage girl who had spent the last 4 days walking through the hills of 2 provinces with a secret under her tunic, and she sang. The song she sang, standing in the doorway of her old kinswoman's house with her old kinswoman's hands probably still on her own, is one of the great songs of the human race. The old Latin-speaking worshippers would call it the Magnificat, after its first word in their tongue. In the Aramaic that Mary and Elizabeth actually spoke, the sentences would have had a different music. But the shape of the thing was the same. "My soul doth magnify the Lord," she said, "and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior, for he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For, behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. For he that is mighty hath done to me great things, and holy is his name. And his mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation." The song did not stop there. It grew. Every phrase opened into the next phrase, and every phrase leaned on the voices of older songs. The shape of it was the shape of Hannah's song in the book of Samuel, that other song of another mother who had been given a son when she had long since given up asking. The song Hannah had sung in the sanctuary at Shiloh 1,000 years before, as she handed her little boy Samuel over to the priest. Mary had known Hannah's song since her childhood. Her mother would have sung it to her at the fireside. The women of Nazareth would have sung it at the festival meals. Every line of Hannah's song had lived in Mary's memory since she was a little girl, and now, standing in an old woman's doorway in a hill village of Judea, with the child of Hannah's spiritual sister kicking in the body in front of her, and with the child of a newer and stranger promise turning in her own, Mary let Hannah's song rise up in her own voice and come out in new words for a new moment. "He hath showed strength with his arm," she sang. "He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seats and exalted them of low degree. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent empty away. He hath holpen his servant Israel, in remembrance of his mercy, as he spake to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his seed forever." Every phrase was a quiet revolution. The proud were scattered, the mighty were put down, the lowly were exalted, the hungry were filled, the rich were sent away empty. This was not pious drawing-room poetry. This was the old song of Israel about what the Lord was in the habit of doing when the Lord got involved in human affairs, and Mary, with her young, clear voice, was singing it as if it had just come true. Her soul magnified the Lord, because the Lord had not looked to the palaces of Herod, or to the audience chambers of Caesar Augustus in Rome, or to the council rooms of the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem to find the mother of the Messiah. The Lord had looked to Nazareth. The Lord had looked to the house of a carpenter's betrothed. The Lord had looked to the low estate of his handmaiden. And the mother of Elizabeth's Lord, standing in Elizabeth's doorway, understood that this single choice was a small preview of the whole long habit of the God she served. The God of Israel had always done it this way. He had always passed over the great for the small. He had always chosen the younger brother over the elder. He had always taken the shepherd and left the king's son in his father's court, and now, in her own body, he had done it again. Elizabeth listened. She listened with the full attention of a woman who knew her scriptures, and who was herself 6 months along in a pregnancy nobody in the village had quite believed in, and she heard what Mary was saying, and the sentences of Mary's song slid in alongside her own short, quiet sentence that she had been repeating to herself for the 5 months of her hiddenness. "Thus hath the Lord dealt with me," she had said, "in the days wherein he looked on me, to take away my reproach among men." And now here was her young kinswoman, standing on her threshold, singing the same theology back to her in a broader key. The Lord had looked, the Lord had regarded, the Lord had chosen the low. The song was the same song. It had only taken on a new voice. They went inside together. The young woman set down her traveling bundle. The old woman drew her to the bench by the hearth and brought her water and bread. Somewhere in the house, the silent figure of the old priest moved, or looked on, or stood in the doorway of the inner room, and if he did not hear the whole of Mary's song with his ears, he understood its substance as any father in his position would understand it, because the messenger who had spoken to him in the holy place had told him enough for him to recognize. When the young woman from the north appeared on his threshold, what kind of visit had come to his house? Mary stayed. That is the part of the story that too many people read past too quickly, because the scene in the doorway is so famous that the 3 months after it look, by comparison, like an afterthought. The 3 months after it were not an afterthought. They were, in many ways, the most important months in the whole history of the friendship between these two women, and probably the most important 3 months in Mary's early life as the mother of her son. Mary abode with her about 3 months, the text says. She stayed. She did not turn around and go back to Nazareth after her great arrival. She unpacked her bundle. She settled into the small guest quarters of Zechariah and Elizabeth's stone house. She went to the well with her older cousin in the cool hour of the morning. She helped with the grinding of the grain. She knelt on the floor by the hearth and kneaded the bread. She learned the ways of a house she had never lived in before. The old priest was in the house through all of this. He was still mute. His weeks of service in Jerusalem had long since ended, and he had not spoken a word since, and he would not speak a word for several months more. He sat in his usual place. He read the scrolls in the afternoon light through the open door. He came to the table at meals and folded his hands and nodded gravely at the blessing the two women now would take turns pronouncing over the bread. He watched the two of them moving together about the small tasks of the house with an expression on his old face that, if the two women had been looking closely enough to read it, would have told them a great deal about what the silent months had been teaching him. He was not resentful of his muteness. He had worked past that. He was, by the time of Mary's arrival, a man in the middle of a long private education whose curriculum had been set for him by the angel in the holy place, and he was attending to his lessons with the quiet, steady concentration of a good student. The two women, meanwhile, talked. They talked the way women in a house together have always talked, about the small daily matters of the day, and about the great vertiginous matter of what was happening to both of them. Elizabeth told Mary everything. She told her about the day her husband had come back from Jerusalem with his eyes changed and his tongue stopped. She told her about the silent exchange on the path. She told her about the day she had first felt the child move inside her and had known it was real. She told her about the 5 months of hiding and the single sentence she had sung over and over to herself in the small hours of the night. And Mary told Elizabeth what she had not yet told anyone, because there had not been anyone to tell, because her betrothed did not know, and her parents did not know, and the messenger had been the only other witness to the conversation in Nazareth. She told Elizabeth about the messenger. She told her what he had said. She told her the name of the son who had been named for her. She told her about the sign of the kinswoman pregnant in her old age, and how she had walked southward for 4 days with that sign as the one bright thing in her whole mind. Elizabeth listened. Mary listened. They began to see each other's pregnancies not as two separate facts, but as one interleaved plan, two movements of a single piece of music that were meant to be heard together. The older woman, who was further along, took the younger woman under her care in the small domestic ways that only a more experienced mother can. She showed her how to ease the ache in her back by sleeping on her side. She showed her what to eat when the nausea of early pregnancy came over her in the mornings. She taught her the little songs the women of her village sang over their unborn children. She did, in short, for her young kinswoman what older pregnant women have been doing for younger pregnant women for the whole of the history of the human race. And she did it while herself, in the final third of a pregnancy that was itself a minor miracle of its own. 3 months passed. The olives in the terraces outside turned from pale green to darker green. The nights grew slightly shorter. The small domestic music of the stone house deepened and settled. The old priest grew more accustomed to his silence and more steady in his routines. The old wife grew heavier with her son and more content in the company of the young cousin who had come to her. And Mary, day by day, began to show. Not yet obviously, not yet in a way that a passing neighbor would see through the loose folds of her traveling cloak, but in a way that a woman's own eye, looking down at her own body in the morning, would begin to notice. She had arrived on the threshold, still a young girl in outline. She was leaving 3 months later, unmistakably with child. She had to go. She could not stay forever. She had a betrothed back in Nazareth who did not yet know about any of this. She had a family. She had a town. She had a whole hard conversation ahead of her with Joseph the carpenter, a conversation she could not keep postponing. And Elizabeth, at the end of those 3 months, was deep into her 9th month. Her time was near. The old wife was going to bring forth her child within days or weeks. And Mary, having come to attend to her kinswoman through the long middle of the pregnancy, seems to have decided, or perhaps the two of them together decided, that she would be on her way home before the final hour came. The text is brief on this too. Mary abode with her about 3 months, it says, and returned to her own house. So she gathered her things. She wrapped her traveling bundle. She embraced the old woman who had taken her in at her doorstep and called her blessed and shared 3 months of her life with her. She stepped out onto the path, down between the olive terraces, down the long familiar slope toward the road. She turned north. She began, with whatever caravan was going her way, the long walk back over the hills to the village she had left 4 months earlier, back to her parents and her betrothed, and the small house where her old bed was waiting, and her loom was still strung with the thread she had left on it. She would walk into Nazareth, not the same girl who had walked out of it. She would walk in carrying, now plainly, a body that every eye in her village would soon enough read for what it was saying. What came next for her was not the business of the house in the hill country any longer. What came next for the house in the hill country was the end of Elizabeth's 9th month, the tightening of her body, the signs that every older woman of the village would know how to read, and the first pains of a labor that a woman of her age had been told she would never have, and had now come, at last, to endure. The pains began, as pains of this kind always begin, in a small way at an ordinary hour, on an ordinary morning. She was bending over the hearth, perhaps, or lifting a jar of water, or simply sitting on the low bench by the doorway in the first pale light of day, and a tightening crossed the front of her abdomen that she had never felt before but recognized instantly for what it was. A woman of her priestly line, raised among mothers and aunts and sisters of mothers, had heard every description of what the onset of labor felt like 1,000 times before she had ever carried a child of her own. She did not need a book. She did not need a midwife to explain it to her. She knew. She sat very still for a long moment, letting the first wave pass, and then she rose and moved through her house with the careful purposefulness of an old woman who has just been told by her own body that a day she had waited 60 years for had now arrived. The old priest was at her side in a moment. He could not ask her what was wrong, because he could not ask her anything. But he had been watching her for 9 months the way he had not watched her in the whole of their earlier marriage, and he understood the shape of the pause she had just taken. He put his hand on her shoulder. She nodded to him and laid her hand over his. He went to the door and beckoned to a neighbor's child going past on some early errand. And by the time the sun had climbed over the eastern ridge of the village, the women of the hill country were already converging on the house of the priest and his barren wife, because word moved fast in villages of that size, and a labor was a thing that every woman in the community came to when it began. The birthing of children in ancient Israel was the collective work of the women of a village. A midwife would usually lead, some older, experienced woman whose hands had caught more babies than she could number, and around her would gather any number of aunts and neighbors and married daughters and older cousins, each with her particular role. One would bring the water for the washing. One would bring the clean linen strips for the swaddling. One would bring the small stone bowl of salt, with which, according to old custom, the newborn's skin would be rubbed after the first washing, to harden it and to bless it. One would stay with the mother through the hours, holding her hands, wiping her forehead, murmuring the old encouragements that mothers had murmured to laboring daughters since the days before the writing of words. The men of the village, in the ordinary way of these things, stayed outside. A husband would wait in the courtyard or in the next house over, pacing and pretending not to pace, until a woman came to the door with the news. Zechariah denied the usual business of the waiting husband by his silence, paced the courtyard anyway, because that much of the tradition was available to him. The labor was hard. It is not a thing that should be softened to make a story. A woman of Elizabeth's age, bringing forth her first child, was not a routine matter, even in a country where childbirth was itself more perilous than any modern reader easily imagines. Her body had not done this before. The muscles had not been trained by earlier labors. The hips had grown stiffer with the decades. Whatever strength a younger woman brings to the long hours of bearing a child, Elizabeth had to find by some deeper reserve, somewhere beneath the ordinary strength of the body. In whatever place, the old prayers and the long years of quiet faithfulness had been storing up against a day she had not known was coming. The women around her kept watch. The midwife bent low over the bed and spoke to her in the low, steady voice that women who have caught babies for 40 years learn to use. The hours passed. The shadows moved across the packed earth of the courtyard where the silent husband was pacing. The small cries of a woman in labor rose and fell from the inner room of the stone house, and the neighbors who were not inside, the men of the village and the children too young to be sent in with linen, loitered at a respectful distance along the path, pretending to have errands in that quarter of the village, and stopping whenever a new cry rose to listen. And then, in the late afternoon, or the early evening, or whenever in the long day it was, the cries inside the house took on a different pitch, and then stopped, and in the silence that followed them, a new sound rose that nobody in the village had been certain they would ever hear from that particular room. A baby's cry. Thin and furious, and exactly as a newborn's cry ought to be, the small, loud, indignant complaint of a new human being who has just been pulled out of the only world he has ever known into a cold and noisy one. The women inside broke into their own cries of joy, the old ululations that women of that country made at weddings and at births, the high rolling sound that was meant to carry through the walls of the house and tell the whole of the surrounding neighborhood that something was to be celebrated. Out in the courtyard the old priest heard it, and sat down slowly on the low stone bench beside the door, and put his head in his hands. Out on the path, a neighbor's wife ran for the nearest house to spread the news. Within a quarter of an hour, every door in the village had opened, and every woman who could walk was coming up the path toward the house of Zechariah, because the word was that his wife had been delivered and that the child was alive and the child was a boy. Inside, the midwife washed the infant with warm water, rubbed him with salt, laid him on a square of clean linen, and wrapped him tightly in the swaddling bands the way babies had been wrapped in that country since long before anybody could remember. The bands were long strips of linen, perhaps 10 inches wide and several feet long, and they were wound round the baby in a particular pattern that bound his limbs close to his body so that he would sleep soundly and grow straight. The old custom held that an unswaddled baby would grow crooked, that the soft bones needed the outside support of the cloth to align themselves properly, that a child left loose in his first weeks would be a child restless for the rest of his life. The midwife wrapped him expertly, laid him on Elizabeth's chest, and stepped back. The old woman looked down at the small face pressed against her own skin, at the tiny hand that had already found its way out of the swaddling and was opening and closing against the linen of her nightdress, at the crown of his head still damp from the washing, and she looked up at the ceiling of her stone house with an expression her neighbors would talk about for the rest of their lives. "Thus hath the Lord dealt with me," she would have said in her heart if she was not saying it out loud. And this time the sentence had gone at last past the future tense and had rooted itself permanently in the past. The women came. They brought bread, they brought oil, they brought honey cakes. They brought small gifts for the new mother, a cloak she could wrap round herself in the first cold weeks of recovery, a tightly woven reed basket for the baby, a small oil lamp to burn beside the bed in the long nights. They crowded into the inner room in 2s and 3s to congratulate Elizabeth, to exclaim over the smallness of the baby's fingers, to marvel with a kind of hushed and half-superstitious wonder at the fact of him being there at all. They had known Elizabeth all their lives. They had watched her carry her childlessness through her 20s and her 30s and her 40s and her 50s and into her 60s, and they had stopped asking her about children long ago, because asking had become unkind. And now here she was, gray-haired and tired and smiling in the lamplight, with a newborn infant on her chest, and a whole roomful of women weeping at the sight of him. And her neighbors and her cousins heard how the Lord had showed great mercy upon her, and they rejoiced with her. That verb, rejoiced, did not mean what it means in a polite modern drawing room. In a hill village of ancient Judea, rejoicing was a physical and collective business. It meant singing. It meant clapping. It meant food set out on tables in every house for anyone who cared to drop in. It meant the ululations of the women carrying down the narrow alleys between the houses late into the night. It meant the men of the village, ordinarily reserved, coming to the door of the old priest's house with cups of wine in their hands to toast him silently, since he could not return their toasts in words, but could meet their eyes and raise his own cup in the old priestly gesture of blessing. It meant, in short, the whole small community of the village arranging itself for a few days around the single fact that something wonderful had happened, that a long grief had been lifted, that the God of Israel had not, after all, forgotten an old woman who had mostly forgotten herself how to expect his remembering. The news moved outward from the village. Within a day, the nearby villages had heard. Within a week, the news had reached as far as the other priestly families in the region. The families of the course of Abijah scattered across the Judean highlands. Men who had served alongside Zechariah at the altar and knew his story in outline, and now received the further news of it, with a widening of their eyes and a slow shake of the head. And underneath the rejoicing, running like a minor note beneath the major key, was the particular weight of Zechariah's silence. By now the whole of the village knew about the silence. They had known about it for 9 months. They had watched the old priest come back from Jerusalem with his mouth stopped, and had waited, through the long, slow months of his wife's pregnancy, for some explanation. They had heard the rumor that he had seen a vision. They had half believed it. Some of them had probably said behind his back that he had suffered some small stroke or some sickness of the brain, and that the vision was a story his wife was telling to spare him the indignity. But the pregnancy itself was hard to argue with. An old woman who had been barren for 60 years did not simply become pregnant without some cause. The two strangenesses, the mute husband and the pregnant old wife, had been laid alongside each other in the village gossip and had reinforced each other, and by the time the baby was born, most of the neighbors had come, privately, to the conclusion that something not quite ordinary had visited this particular household. What exactly had visited it, they did not know. They were about to find out. The old Jewish law laid down a schedule. Every male child, by the covenant the Lord had made with Abraham more than 2,000 years before, was to be circumcised on the 8th day of his life. It was the sign of the covenant, cut into the flesh of every Jewish boy since the first one, the mark that said, as plainly as a mark can say, that the child belonged to the God of Abraham and to the people of Abraham. The ceremony was a household occasion rather than a temple one. A mohel, a man skilled in the small surgery, came to the house. The family assembled. The father held the child, or an honored relative held the child, and the mohel, with a small sharp flint or a fine steel knife, performed the quick cut. The wound was dressed. A blessing was said. And traditionally, in that same brief ceremony, the child was given his name, spoken aloud for the first time, entered into the register of his family and his tribe and his people. The 8th day came round. The house filled. The older relatives arrived, the priestly cousins from the surrounding villages, the aunts and uncles on both sides. A small, modest crowd of faces that would have come to the circumcision of any priestly son, but which had come today in numbers slightly greater than usual, because this particular son was the son of an old barren woman and a mute priest, and nobody wanted to miss the ceremony. The mohel prepared his instruments. The women set out bread and cups of wine. The child, still warm from his mother's body, was brought in wrapped in the best linen Elizabeth owned, and was laid in the arms of one of the old uncles for the cutting. The cut was made. The child cried sharply once and was hushed. The wound was attended to. The blessing was said. And then, with the entire company of the family and the neighbors standing around in the room or crowded into the courtyard outside, it came time for the naming. Here the old custom took over. A firstborn son in a priestly family was expected, in most households, to be given his father's name. Zechariah's son would be a second Zechariah. That was not a rule written anywhere. It was a custom, a strong and traditional one, and the assembled relatives had come, most of them, expecting that custom to be honored. The uncle, holding the child, looked up at the mother and asked the formal question, "What shall the child be called?" It was a question intended to be answered with a name everyone already assumed. It was a ritual question. The mother was supposed to say the father's name, and everyone would nod, and the small formal business of the naming would be concluded, and the bread and the wine would come out. Elizabeth, sitting on the bench by the hearth with her face a little pale from the recovery but her voice strong, spoke up. "Not so," she said. "He shall be called John." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then a small murmur ran through the gathered relatives. John? Johannan? It was a perfectly good name. It was the name of several of the old high priests of the Hasmonean line. It meant, as every Hebrew speaker in the room knew, that the Lord has been gracious. But it was not the father's name. It was not any name in the father's family. It was not any name in the mother's family. None of the cousins, none of the uncles, none of the great-uncles or grandfathers on either side of the priestly line had ever been called by this name. The uncle holding the child looked around. The women looked at each other. One of the older aunts spoke up first, in that tone aunts use when they are about to correct a decision they regard as slightly misguided. "There is none of thy kindred that is called by this name," she said. It was meant kindly. It was meant to point out, in case the old mother had been rattled by the recent events of her life and had lost track of the family tradition, that the child's name ought to come from within the house, and that there was no precedent for this one. Elizabeth held her ground. "He shall be called John," she said again. Whatever private conversation of signs and written words she had had with her silent husband in the preceding months had evidently produced between them a clear agreement on this point, and she was not going to be moved off it by the gentle pressure of a sister-in-law. But the sister-in-law was not the only one there. The room was full of relatives, every one of whom had an opinion, and the small social machinery that an ancient household could bring to bear on an irregular decision began now to turn. Cousins whispered to cousins. An older uncle shook his head. Another aunt leaned toward Elizabeth and tried to reason with her gently. Somebody, in the course of this, suggested what a sensible group of relatives always suggested when the mother of a child seemed to be unreasonable on a naming question. They appealed to the father. They turned, all of them together, toward the silent figure of Zechariah, who had been standing at the side of the room through the whole of the ceremony, with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes moving from face to face in that careful, quiet way he had developed over the 9 months of his silence. They made signs to him. They could not, of course, simply ask him. His muteness, they had come to assume, was also a kind of deafness, because a man who cannot speak is often assumed by his neighbors to be not quite present in the ordinary conversational world. He was not deaf. He could hear them perfectly. But the custom of the village had been to address him in gestures for 9 months, and at the naming ceremony, with the question of the baby's name now in live dispute, the assembled relatives reverted instinctively to gestures. They pointed to the baby. They held up their hands in a shrug of inquiry. They made the small universal motion of writing on the palm, which in every culture has always meant, "What do you say? What do you want? How would you have this resolved?" Zechariah, for the first time in 9 months, was being asked to settle a point of family business. The relatives wanted to know what he thought. They assumed, most of them, that he would side with them. They assumed he would confirm the family tradition, gently overrule his wife's surprising suggestion, and let the child be named Zechariah the Younger according to the proper pattern. He asked for a writing tablet. He made the request by gesture because he had no other way. He mimed the action of writing. Somebody in the room understood and sent a child running to fetch a small wooden writing tablet, the kind schoolboys in the village used for their lessons. The tablet was a thin board with a shallow hollow in its center, filled with a layer of soft wax, over which a bronze stylus could be drawn to leave marks in the wax that could later be smoothed over with the blunt end of the stylus. It was the ordinary writing surface of ordinary letters and ordinary accounts. The child returned. The tablet was brought to Zechariah. He took it in one hand. He took the stylus in the other. The whole room held its breath. he bent his head to the tablet. And in the clear, deliberate strokes of a priest who had been taught to read and write since his own boyhood, he cut into the wax. In Hebrew, or more likely in the Aramaic, everyone in the room would have been able to read at a glance a sentence of 4 words. His name is John. Not, his name shall be John, as if the matter were yet to be decided. Not, I agree with my wife, as if the decision were a concession. His name is John, already settled. The naming had been done long before any of the assembled relatives had climbed the path to the house that morning, because the naming had been done in a chamber of the Temple of Jerusalem 9 months earlier, by a voice that had come from the presence of God. Zechariah's 4 words on the writing tablet were not an opinion. They were a report of a fact. The father and the mother, independently of each other and from different rooms of a house that had been under an unusual discipline for the whole of the pregnancy, had given the same name, because the same angel had given it to both of them, and no family tradition on earth, however venerable, was going to alter it. The room was quiet. The relatives passed the tablet around. They read it. They looked at each other. The cousins, who had been sure they knew how this would go, exchanged small, rueful glances. The aunt who had raised the objection closed her mouth. The uncle holding the baby looked down at the small, round face with a new and slightly alarmed attentiveness, because a child to whom so unusual a naming had just been given was a child who might possibly turn out to be a more unusual child than the ordinary priestly nephew they had all been expecting to welcome into the family. They marveled, the old text says. They marveled all. The ceremony went on, but it went on in a subtly altered key. The blessings were said. The cups of wine were poured. But there was a new silence underneath the rejoicing, the kind of silence that falls on a group of people who have just realized that something they had not quite been willing to take seriously all year may in fact be more serious than they had allowed. And then the second thing happened. It was the thing that made the first thing impossible to dismiss afterwards. Zechariah, who had set down the writing tablet on the low bench beside him, opened his mouth, as an old man often does when a ceremony he has been presiding over has gone well, and he is about to offer a last quiet word. He opened his mouth, and something came out of it. A sound, a word, a syllable. He opened his mouth, and his tongue was loosed, and he spoke. He had not spoken for 9 months. He had not spoken since the evening in the holy place, when Gabriel had pronounced his sentence of silence at the altar of incense. He had carried through 2 full seasons, and the better part of a third, the small daily humiliation of a man who could not return a greeting, could not bless his wife, could not sing the Shema, could not argue with a neighbor, could not even tell a child to mind the goat that was eating his new onions. And now, the moment the name of his son had been written down and acknowledged, the lock on his mouth gave way, and the air that had been held behind it for 9 months came out. And out of that air came the first words he had said since he was a younger man in a temple 6 months south of here. What he said was not a casual word. He did not, when his tongue was loosed, say, "Is the wine nearly gone?" or "Pass me that cup." He did what a priest does when a priest has been given back his voice. He blessed the Lord. He opened his mouth, and he blessed God. The first sound out of him after the long silence was praise. And all fear came on them that dwelt round about them. That is the line the old text puts down next, almost dryly, and it is the line that captures better than any elaboration the effect on the village. The relatives went home. The neighbors who had come in for the ceremony went home. They went home, and they told their own households what they had seen. And then they told their friends in the next village. And the friends told their friends. And the story began to spread through the hill country of Judea the way a story of that kind spreads, from house to house, from well to well, from one evening fire to another. An old woman had borne a son at an age past bearing. The son had been given a name that nobody in the family had any precedent for. The mute father had written down the same name on a tablet at the 8th day, without knowing what his wife had said, and then the father's muteness had broken at the moment the name was confirmed. The two things together, the impossible pregnancy and the impossible silence, and the impossible simultaneous naming, and the impossible restoration of the voice, could not be ignored. They were not of the ordinary order of things. And when a whole community, up and down the terraced slopes of 100 limestone villages in the hills south of Jerusalem, finds itself hearing a story of that kind, something settles on that community that is not exactly the same as ordinary piety and is not exactly the same as ordinary anxiety. Something that the old scriptures called the fear of the Lord, a reverence, a lowering of the voice in the middle of conversations, a quick glance up at the hills at unexpected moments, a way of treating the old priest's house when one walked past it that had not existed a year ago. And all these sayings were noised abroad throughout all the hill country of Judea. That is exactly how the old account puts it, and it captures the thing precisely. The sayings moved. They went abroad. They were not contained in one village. They carried within a few weeks across the whole region. What manner of child shall this be? The people asked each other, in the houses and at the wells and on the roads between the villages. What kind of child is this going to be? The question was not rhetorical. Every mother who heard the story asked it aloud and waited for an answer. Every old farmer leaning on his staff at the edge of his field asked it. Every rabbi in every synagogue of every hill country town asked it. A child whose coming had been announced by such strangeness, whose father had gone silent for 9 months, whose mother had been delivered of him in her old age, whose name had been given from outside the family in unusual circumstances, was not going to be an ordinary priestly nephew growing up to take his turn in his father's division at the altar. Something was going to become of him. What, the hill country could not yet say. The hill country could only ask. The hand of the Lord was with him. The text ends the account of his infancy with that short and heavy sentence, and the sentence does not explain itself. It means what it says. Something was with him. The same Spirit who had fallen on him in the womb when his mother heard her cousin's greeting at the door was still with him in the cradle. The same Spirit would be with him in whatever house he grew up in, through whatever small events made up the ordinary days of his earliest years. He was a child like other children in most ways, suckled and rocked and swaddled and gradually unswaddled, taught to walk on the packed earth floor of his parents' house, taught the first few words of the Shema as soon as he could form them. But he was not quite like other children. The hand of the Lord was with him in some way that the village, even without being able to define it, could sense. The old priest watched him. The old mother watched him. The hill country, in its own quiet way, watched him. And the question hung over his cradle and over his first steps and over the first words he ever formed with his lips. What manner of child shall this be? The question would take a long time to answer. The question, in a certain sense, was waiting for him to grow up and answer it himself. But before he could grow up into the answer, before the hill country could learn what the child was going to become, the old priest, whose tongue had been loosed on the day of the naming, had a long speech to deliver. He had been composing it in some inner chamber of his mind for 9 months. He had worked it over in the silence of his own house, phrase by phrase, listening to his wife and his young kinswoman singing their own songs at the hearth. And he had known, for those long quiet months, that when his mouth was opened again, the first long speech out of it would be the speech that had been waiting in the back of his throat since the afternoon the angel had spoken over him in the holy place. The relatives were still in the house. The child was still in the uncle's arms. The neighbors were still crowding the doorway. The air was still thick with the marvel of what had just happened. And Zechariah, whose tongue was loose again after 9 months, took a breath and began to prophesy. The word prophesy is worth pausing over, because it is the word the old account uses, and it is not a word that an ancient Jewish writer used casually. Prophesy did not mean, in the vocabulary of the synagogues and the rabbis, making a guess about the future, nor did it mean offering a religious opinion, nor did it mean reciting a favorite psalm with passion. Prophesy meant that the Spirit of the Lord, the same breath that had come down on Moses and on Samuel and on Isaiah and on Jeremiah, had fallen on a human being and was speaking, now, through that human being's mouth. Prophesy was the return of the living voice, and the living voice had not, as the hill country of Judea understood things, been heard in Israel for 4 centuries. No prophet had spoken. No burning bush had flamed on any mountainside. No seer had walked into a king's throne room and announced, "Thus saith the Lord." The prophetic spirit had withdrawn, as everyone in the land had long since learned to accept, and the silence, the great silence, had been the condition of the pious life for as long as anybody's grandfather's grandfather could remember. And now, in a small stone house, in a small hill village on the morning of an 8th-day naming ceremony, an old priest, standing with his hand on the head of his newborn son, opened his mouth, and the long silence broke. It broke out of a man whose own personal silence had been 9 months long, and the personal silence breaking became, by the same breath, the public silence breaking. The Spirit of the Lord fell on Zechariah. The small, crowded room became, for the length of his utterance, the first place in 4 centuries in which the living prophetic voice of the God of Israel was being heard aloud. The relatives closest to him felt it first. They felt the hair on their arms rise. They stepped back a pace without meaning to. The old uncle holding the baby gently passed the swaddled infant to another uncle and moved toward the wall of the room to make space, because a man who is about to prophesy needs room the way a singer needs room, and his hands will move, and his whole body will fill out into the weight of what is coming through him. He began, as the old prophets had always begun, with a blessing. "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel," he said. The words came out of him in the careful, full, measured cadence of the priestly Hebrew, or perhaps of the Aramaic that the relatives actually spoke, and they were the ancient opening formula of every great act of temple blessing. The opening a man would have used if he were beginning a formal barakah, a benediction in the liturgical sense. "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel," not "blessed be me," or "blessed be my wife," or "blessed be the family that has been given this child," although every one of those blessings would have been appropriate in the moment. No. "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel." He was starting, that is to say, in the only place a priest and a prophet could start, which was with the giver and not the gift. He was setting down, before he went any further, the grammatical and theological foundation of everything he was about to say. Every verb that would come out of his mouth in the next 2 minutes would have the Lord God of Israel as its subject. The old priest and the old mother and the newborn son and the relatives standing around, and the village beyond the walls and the hill country beyond the village, and the whole history of the people into which the child had just been born, were all about to be rearranged in his speech into their proper relationship to the one who had done the acting. "For he hath visited and redeemed his people." That sentence coming out of the old man's mouth after the formal opening blessing was the heart of the whole thing. It was the first thing he said about what the Lord had actually done, and it was a sentence that would not have made immediate sense to any political or military analyst of the hill country at that moment. By every visible measure in Judea that morning, the Lord had not visited his people. The Romans were still in the country. Herod the king was still on the throne. The temple was still run by a priestly aristocracy that had long since lost the confidence of the pious poor. The taxes were still being collected. The occupied land was still occupied. No chariots of fire had been seen. No armies of angels had come down on the Mount of Olives. By any reasonable accounting, nothing visible had happened. The only new thing in all of Palestine that morning was a baby boy in the arms of an uncle in a hill village. And yet, Zechariah was standing there saying that the Lord had visited and redeemed his people. He was using the perfect tense, the tense of completed action. Not will visit, not shall one day redeem, hath visited, hath redeemed. The old priest, filled with the Spirit, was reporting a thing that had already happened, that was already in the past, at a moment when no outward sign of it was visible anywhere in the land. He was saying, in effect, that the visitation had already taken place, that the work of the Lord had already begun, and that the proof of it was standing in his own wife's arms, and the proof of it was waiting 6 months north in a little village of Galilee, in the body of a young woman, whose name he had learned only 3 months earlier when she had come dusty from the road to his door. The visitation had begun. It was not conspicuous yet, but it had begun. And the old priest, because the Spirit was giving him the words, could speak of it as if the whole of it were already accomplished, because what the Spirit knows is not subject to the small delays of outward events, and hath raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. The phrase horn of salvation was a phrase out of the old Psalms and the old prophetic oracles, a phrase every Jew in the room would have heard 100 times and understood instantly. A horn, in the Hebrew of the Scriptures, was an image of strength. It was the horn of the wild ox, the horn of the ram, the raised-up power of an animal about to charge. To raise up a horn was to raise up a strong one, a deliverer, a king. And the horn was being raised up in the house of his servant David, of David, the royal line, the line that had been promised a throne that would never be taken away, the line that had produced, after the golden age of the king who killed the giant and wrote the Psalms, a long string of kings who had declined and declined and declined until the exile had broken the dynasty apart and left only a scattered family of descendants. The old priest was saying that the horn of salvation had been raised up in that house, in that line. His own son was not of the house of David. His own son was of the house of Aaron, the priestly line. So the horn he was speaking of was not in his speech his own son. It was someone else, someone in the line of David, someone about whom a tired old priest could prophesy on the morning of his own son's naming, because the Spirit had given him to see that his own son's naming was the prelude to a greater one. As he spake by the mouth of his holy prophets, which have been since the world began, he was locating the whole thing in the long river of prophecy that ran back through the Scriptures of his people to the very beginning. Every prophet who had ever promised a Messiah, every psalmist who had ever sung a psalm of the anointed king, every voice in the long chorus that had been singing about this moment for centuries, was being invoked by the old priest as a witness to what was now happening since the world began. That was the sweep of it. Not since Moses, not since David, since the world began. The plan of it went that far back. The Spirit was telling him that the thing now being brought to light in his own house was a thing that had been held in heaven since the first week of the creation of the world, and that every sentence of prophecy ever given in the whole long history of his people had been pointing toward this moment, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all that hate us. Here his voice took on a different weight. The enemies, the hand of all that hate us. In the mouth of an ordinary Judean patriot, those phrases would have meant plainly and politically the Romans. They would have meant Herod and his half-Edomite court. They would have meant the Greeks, whose culture had flooded over the land since Alexander, the Samaritans whose quarrels rankled on the northern border, the Ammonites and Moabites and Edomites of the old tribal grudges. And no Jew in the room would have taken those words in a narrowly political sense, because the Hebrew tradition had always held that the enemies of Israel were, at the deepest level, not just the foreign armies, but the forces that stood behind the foreign armies, the powers of disobedience and idolatry and death that had oppressed the human race since the Gate of Eden. The salvation Zechariah was speaking of was meant in both senses at once. The people would be saved from their enemies. The Lord would deliver them out of the hand of all that hated them. What the deliverance would finally look like, the old priest did not say. He had the shape of it. He did not have its outline. The Spirit did not give him more than was appropriate to give. to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant. Now he was reaching back again, further back than David, all the way back to the patriarchs. The mercy promised to our fathers, the covenant. Those phrases had only one referent in the memory of a pious Jew. They referred to the promises God had made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, in the days before there had even been a nation of Israel. They referred to the long series of commitments cut into the narrative of the old scriptures by the God who had called a single childless man out of Ur of the Chaldees, and told him that his descendants would be as the stars of the sky and as the sand of the seashore, that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Every pious Jew had heard those promises recited on every Sabbath of his life. Zechariah was saying, standing in his own stone house in the hill country, that the remembering of those promises was, at that very moment, taking place. The Lord was performing the mercy. The Lord was remembering the covenant. The remembering was not abstract. It had a face. It had a body. It had been growing through the summer and the autumn in his wife's womb, and it was now in a wrapping of fresh linen in his own son's uncle's arms. The oath which he sware to our father Abraham, that he would grant unto us, that we, being delivered out of the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him, all the days of our life. The oath. There it was again, that word, oath. It was a word that had a particular resonance in that house, because the old wife's name, Elisheba, the oath of God, was inscribed in the very syllables of this very sentence. The old priest, saying the oath which he sware, was saying, at some level, the name of his wife. The oath had been sworn to Abraham. The oath had been carried through the generations. The oath had taken flesh, in a certain sense, in the body of Elizabeth, who had been its namesake all her life, without ever quite guessing that the thing which had been her name would also be her vocation. The oath was now being fulfilled. And what was the fulfillment to look like? Zechariah described it in the simplest possible terms. That being delivered, the people of the Lord might serve him without fear, might serve him in holiness and righteousness all the days of their life. The deliverance was not at the deepest level for the sake of political independence. It was for the sake of worship. It was so that a people whom the Lord had made for himself could at last serve him without the shadow of fear falling across their prayers, without the shadow of Rome, without the shadow of Herod, without the deeper shadow that the Romans and the Herods only concentrated into visible form, holiness and righteousness before him all the days of their life. That was what the whole long plan had been for. That was what the horn of salvation was being raised up to accomplish. That was the end toward which the covenant with Abraham had been moving since the day it was first cut. The old priest paused. His voice had been rising through the prophecy, carrying the weight of the great old themes, and the room had been as still as any room could be with that many relatives in it. He took another breath, and now, for the first time in the speech, he turned his face down toward the baby in the uncle's arms. He looked at his son. He looked at John. And the whole register of the prophecy shifted. And thou, child, he said, shalt be called the prophet of the highest. The room caught its breath. He was addressing the baby. He was speaking directly, in the second person singular, to a creature 8 days old who could not understand a syllable of what was being said to him, who was lying in a wrapping of linen with his eyes shut and his small fists curled against his chest, whose only current contribution to the conversation was the soft, steady breath of his sleeping. And Zechariah, his father, was naming over him a vocation that would take 30 years to unfold. Thou, child, shalt be called the prophet of the highest, not a priest, not a scribe, not a teacher, a prophet, the thing that had been absent from Israel for 4 centuries. The child would be, when he grew, the first prophet of the new era, the one who would step out into the silence and break it with a voice that had not been heard in the land since Malachi had laid down his pen. For thou shalt go before the face of the Lord, to prepare his ways. Before the face of the Lord. The phrase was an old one. It was the phrase used in the Psalms of the great festal processions, in which the Ark of the Covenant had been carried into Jerusalem with trumpets and dancers before it, and priests beside it, and the whole of the people following after. A herald went before the face of a king on any royal progress. A servant went before the face of his master on any journey, to see that the way was passable, and the inn was ready, and the water was drawn. Zechariah was saying, very precisely, that his son was to be the herald before the face of the Lord, not merely before the face of the Messiah, before the face of the Lord himself. The old priest, who had spent his life at an altar in front of a veil behind which the presence of the Lord was said to dwell, was saying that the presence of the Lord was coming out from behind the veil, was approaching the ordinary villages and towns of his country, and that his own son would be the one running ahead to prepare the road. The thought, if the relatives had been able to sit with it for a moment, was almost too large to hold. It was easier to let the sentence pass and take in the next one. To give knowledge of salvation unto his people by the remission of their sin. Now the shape of the child's work began to come into focus. The child was going to give knowledge of salvation. He was going to teach the people what salvation was. And the teaching would be by the remission of their sins, forgiveness, the putting away of what had separated them from the Lord. That was to be the whole substance of what the child would preach when the child grew. Not a political program, not a reform of the priestly aristocracy, not a military uprising against the occupation, forgiveness, repentance, the turning of the hearts. That was to be his work. That was how the way of the Lord was to be prepared. By the cleansing of the hearts of the people who would walk the way. A road full of people carrying unconfessed sins was not a road the Lord could travel upon. The road had to be cleared first. The rubble had to be moved. The blockages had to be taken down. The child, when he grew, would be the clearing of the road. The forerunner's whole ministry was contained in 4 words in that line of the prophecy. And the relatives standing in the stone house on the morning of the naming did not yet understand it, and could not understand it, because the ministry itself had not yet taken shape, and the Jordan River was still 30 years off, simply the Jordan River flowing through its lower valley as it had flowed since the days of Joshua, through the tender mercy of our God. The word was tender. In the Hebrew, or the Aramaic behind it, the word carried the sense of the deep, gut-level pity of a parent for a child, the visceral mercy that moves in the belly and cannot be explained by any calculation of merit. The mercy of the Lord was not a cold legal decision. It was a tender mercy, a bodily mercy, the mercy of a father whose child has fallen and skinned his knee and come running for comfort. Zechariah, saying the word, was saying something about the character of the God whose ways his son would prepare. The God whose face was approaching was not a judge on a cold throne. He was a father with his arms held out. The remission of sins that the Son would preach was not a technical transaction. It was a homecoming, whereby the dayspring from on high hath visited us. Now the old priest reached, as he had been reaching throughout the speech, for an image, and the image he reached for was the image of the dawn, the dayspring, the sunrise, the first long horizontal light that comes up over the eastern ridges and crosses the dark pastures and wakes the villages up one by one, whereby the dayspring from on high hath visited us. The dawn, he was saying, the long-awaited dawn had come. The night was over. The sun, not the sun of the sky, but the sun behind all the other suns, the ultimate light that had been hidden behind the clouds of the 4 centuries of silence, was lifting now over the hills of Judea. And the visit of the dayspring was not a coincidence of weather. It was a visitation. The dayspring had visited. The same verb the old priest had used at the beginning of the prophecy, hath visited, circled back now in the final image. The Lord had visited, the visit had begun, the light was coming up, to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. The words were drawn straight out of Isaiah. Every pious Jew in the room knew them. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light, the old prophet had said 7 centuries earlier. In his vision of a child who was to be born, and a son who was to be given in a country oppressed and occupied and lost in the deep gloom of its own unfaithfulness. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. Zechariah, quoting without quoting, was saying that the Isaiah prophecy was now coming true. The people sitting in darkness, the people under the shadow of death, that was his people. That was Judea under Herod. That was Galilee under the client kings. That was the whole of the diaspora scattered across the Mediterranean, learning languages that were not their own and serving gods that were not theirs to serve. The light was rising. The great light that Isaiah had promised was coming up over those people, and the child in the uncle's arms was to be the morning star that rose a little before the sun, the small bright light in the eastern sky that tells the watchers that the longer night is almost over, to guide our feet into the way of peace. That was the end of it. The last line, the last image, the way of peace. Shalom in the Hebrew of the old blessings. Not peace in the narrow modern sense of the absence of war, though that was part of it, but peace in the full Hebrew sense of wholeness, of things put right, of every ruptured relationship restored, of the body and the mind and the heart and the community and the land and the creatures, all set into their proper alignment with each other and with the Lord who had made them. The guide would guide the feet. The child, grown, would show the way. The feet of the people of the Lord, which had been wandering for 4 centuries down paths that went nowhere, or down paths that went down into captivity, would be turned by the guiding of the forerunner and by the coming of the one whose face he went before, onto the way of peace. That was to be the destination of all of this. And then Zechariah stopped. The prophecy was finished, his mouth closed. The old man stood there in the middle of his own stone house, with the last words still echoing in the cedar beams of the low ceiling, and the room was, for a long moment, absolutely silent. No relative spoke. The baby did not cry. Even the birds outside seemed to have quieted for the duration of the prophecy, and not to have yet remembered to resume. The Spirit who had come down on the old priest lifted off him, gently, the way a breath lifts off a man who has just finished a song. And Zechariah sat down on the bench by the hearth and put his hands on his knees and looked up at his wife. Elizabeth looked back at him. Her face was wet. She had not known he could speak like that. She had not known any priest could speak like that. She had not known anyone in the whole hill country, in the whole of Judea, in the whole of Israel in the last 400 years could speak like that. But she had now heard it, and she would never forget the sound of it. The relatives began to move again. They looked at each other. They looked at the baby. They looked at the old priest. The prophecy had been long, and it had been dense with the old words of the old scriptures, and it had moved at a pace that outran the ordinary understanding of any particular uncle or cousin present. None of them could have reproduced it sentence by sentence afterwards, but all of them had felt it. All of them knew that something had been said in that room that was not of the ordinary order of family speech at a circumcision. All of them would go home that evening and say to their spouses, across their own tables, in their own stone houses, in their own hill villages, that they had heard the old priest of Abijah prophesy on the morning of his son's naming, and that the things he had said were not the things a man says under his own power, and that the child had been given a destiny that no village of 400 souls in the hill country of Judea knew what to do with. The prophecy would carry, as the story of the silence had carried, through the alleys and over the terraces of 100 villages in the next weeks, and the fear that had fallen on the hill country at the loosing of the old priest's tongue would deepen, as the word of his prophecy was repeated from mouth to mouth, into a more profound wondering still. What manner of child shall this be? The question had not gone away. The question had been given now a much fuller weight, because the father of the child had stood up on the morning of the naming and had set over him a vocation that took the whole of the Scriptures to even describe. The relatives eventually began to leave. The wine was drunk, the bread was eaten, the child was laid sleeping on a small pile of folded linen in the corner of the room. One by one the cousins came to kiss Elizabeth on the forehead. One by one the uncles clasped the old priest's hand. They went out of the door and down the path between the terraces and back to their own villages. The afternoon deepened over the hills. The sun slid west. The stone house grew quiet. The three of them, the old priest and his wife and the baby, were alone together in their home for the first time since the labor had begun 2 days earlier, and the silence in the house now was not the silence of the past 9 months, but a different kind of silence altogether, the warm and settled silence of a family at rest. Zechariah and Elizabeth looked at each other across the width of the room. He did not need to speak to her, though he could now. She did not need to speak to him, though she had been speaking to him for 40 or 50 years. They simply looked, and the child slept on his pile of linen with his small hand curled on his cheek, and the small, strong breath of him moved in and out of his small chest, and the hand of the Lord was with him, as the old saying had it, and would remain with him through every year of the childhood that was about to begin.